On a freezing morning in January of 1977, a man named Stefan was standing on the deck of a tugboat in the middle of the Vistula River. The water in Krakow was a dark, churning gray, carrying chunks of ice that knocked against the steel hull with a hollow, metallic ring. Stefan had spent 20 years navigating these currents, and he knew the river like a person knows the hallway of their own home. He could tell the depth by the way the surface rippled and the health of the engine by the vibration under his boots. He was a man who appreciated the predictable nature of his work, where the only surprises were the weather and the occasional log floating downstream. But that morning, as the fog began to lift from the Wawo Castle in the distance, Stefan felt a sudden, sharp jerk in the steering. The engine let out a wet, grinding cough that sent a shudder through the entire frame of the boat. He looked back at the wake and saw something pale and heavy caught in the propeller, something that refused to sink. He had no way of knowing that he had just pulled a secret out of the water that would remain unexplained for the next 50 years. In today's episode, we are going into 12 different stories from across the globe, each involving a kind of danger that hides in plain sight. These are cases where the threat is often a person the victim already knew, or a force so organized it can make a human being simply stop existing. As always, there is background sound designed for a calm, immersive experience, so feel free to settle in. If you enjoy this style of storytelling, I invite you to subscribe, but only if the tone feels right for you. I am curious to know where you are listening from and what time it is in your part of the world. Usually, the people closest to a tragedy are the ones who see the signs last. Before we get into the details of the Vistula, please take a moment to consider the like button. If you could kindly offer to take the like button on a romantic sunset cruise and then, just as you reach the deepest part of the lake, accidentally drop the keys to the boat into the garbage disposal. That would be greatly appreciated. Now, let us get back to the river in Poland. The winter of 1977 was brutal in Krakow, with the temperature dropping so low that the moisture in the air felt like needles against the skin. Stefan wore 3 layers of wool under his heavy canvas jacket, but the damp cold of the river still found its way into his joints. He was 54 years old and worked for the State Navigation Authority, a job that required a quiet mind and a lot of patience. His primary responsibility was to keep the shipping lanes clear of debris and to assist larger barges as they moved through the city. The Vistula was the heart of the city, but in the 70s, it was a gray and industrial place. The air smelled of coal smoke from the nearby factories and the metallic tang of the river silt. Stefan liked the early shifts because the city was quiet, and he could drink his thermos of bitter coffee in peace while the engine hummed. He was a creature of habit, always checking his grease traps at exactly 6 in the morning and logging his fuel consumption with a pencil he kept sharpened to a perfect point. He had a wife and 2 daughters waiting for him in a small apartment on the outskirts of the city. His oldest girl was getting married in the spring, and Stefan spent most of his quiet moments on the boat calculating the cost of the reception. He needed the river to remain calm and his equipment to stay functional so he could keep earning his overtime pay. Life under the socialist administration was a series of quotas and small stresses, and Stefan was proud of the fact that he never missed a deadline. He moved toward the stern of the boat to inspect the damage to the propeller. The tugboat was drifting slowly toward the bank near the Dębniki Bridge, where the water was deep and the current was particularly strong. He grabbed a long wooden pole with a metal hook on the end, a tool he used almost every day to clear away plastic sheeting or tangled fishing nets. He leaned over the rail, squinting through the rising steam of the river to see what had stalled his engine. At first, he thought it was a discarded rug or perhaps a piece of industrial canvas that had blown off a nearby construction site. It was large and off-white, with a rubbery texture that seemed to shimmer under the surface of the gray water. Stefan hooked the edge of the material and began to pull, expecting it to be heavy and waterlogged. But as the object broke the surface, it felt strangely light, as if it were hollow or filled with air. The material didn't have the woven texture of fabric or the slick feel of plastic. It was smooth and strangely supple, stretching slightly as he hauled it onto the metal deck of the tugboat. The wet slapping sound it made as it landed at his feet echoed off the steel hull. Stefan stood over it for a moment, his breath blooming in white clouds in the freezing air, waiting for his brain to categorize what he was looking at. The object was a single, continuous piece of material that looked like a suit or a set of heavy coveralls. It had the distinct shape of a human torso, with long sections that resembled arms and legs trailing behind it. Stefan reached out and touched it with his gloved hand, expecting the cold bite of synthetic rubber. Instead, he felt something that felt disturbingly organic, like the skin of a fish or a piece of processed leather. He walked to the cabin to get his flashlight, his heart beginning to beat with a slow, heavy rhythm in his chest. He came back and shone the light directly onto the pile of pale material lying on the deck. The beam revealed tiny, microscopic pores in the faint, bluish lines of veins that had long since been drained of blood. It was not a suit made of fabric, and it was not a piece of trash. The metal deck was slick with a mixture of river water and oil, and the smell of the silt was suddenly replaced by a faint, chemical scent of vinegar and rot. Stefan felt the vibration of a passing tram on the bridge above, a sound that usually felt grounding but now seemed like a distant roar. He looked down at the pale shape, realizing his boots were only inches away from a face that had no eyes and a mouth that had no teeth. He thought about his daughter's wedding and the sharp point of his pencil, and he suddenly felt like a man standing on a sheet of thin ice that had finally started to crack. He backed away from the object, nearly tripping over a coil of rope. He didn't want to look at it anymore, but his eyes kept returning to the edges of the material. He noticed that the edges were not torn or ragged like something that had been caught in a machine. They were perfectly straight and clean, as if they had been trimmed with a razor or a surgical blade. Stefan went back to the radio in the cabin and called the harbor police, keeping his voice as flat and professional as possible. He told them he had recovered a set of remains, though he didn't know how else to describe them. He sat on the small bench in the cabin and watched the river through the glass, refusing to go back out onto the deck. He stayed there for 30 minutes until a police launch pulled alongside his tugboat. The officers who climbed aboard were young and appeared bored, clearly expecting to find a typical drowning victim or a jumper from the bridge. They walked toward the pile on the deck, and one of them reached out with his boot to flip the material over. He stopped mid-motion, his face turning the same shade of gray as the winter sky. He looked at his partner, and for a long time, neither of them said a word. The harbor police called for a forensic team from the university, and within 2 hours, the dock was crowded with men in long coats and military uniforms. The atmosphere shifted from a routine recovery to something much colder and more secretive. A man in a high-quality wool coat approached Stefan and asked him a series of questions about exactly where the object had been found. He didn't introduce himself, but the way the other officers stepped aside suggested he was from the Internal Security Office. The forensic pathologist arrived and knelt on the deck, wearing thin white gloves that looked fragile against the heavy metal of the boat. He spent a long time examining the pale material, moving his hands along the sections that resembled limbs. He didn't look up when he spoke, but his voice was loud enough for Stefan to hear. He said that this was not a body in the traditional sense. The doctor explained that the object was the entire skin of a human female, removed in one single, continuous piece. There were no bones inside, no muscle tissue, and no organs. It had been processed with a level of anatomical precision that the doctor had never seen in his 30 years of practice. The killer had started at the back of the neck and worked their way down, peeling the person away from themselves until only the outer shell remained. The investigation moved from the tugboat to the morgue, and then into the classified files of the Krakow Police Department. They checked the missing persons reports for the entire region, looking for a young woman who had disappeared in the weeks leading up to the discovery. They found several candidates, but without a face or fingerprints. The skin was impossible to identify. The material had been in the water for some time, which had washed away any trace of the perpetrator's DNA. The most disturbing detail emerged a few days later during the full autopsy of the remains. The pathologist found that the skin had been treated with a specific type of chemical preservative, often used in high-end taxidermy. This meant the killer hadn't just committed a murder. They had spent days or even weeks processing the victim, working in a space that was equipped for complex biological work. The police visited every medical school and veterinary clinic in the city, questioning students and professors about anyone who showed an unusual interest in human anatomy. They looked for people with access to specialized surgical tools and the chemicals found on the skin. But in the late 70s, Poland was a place of deep shadows and many secrets. People were hesitant to talk to the authorities, and the authorities were more interested in political dissidents than they were in a single, bizarre murder. A theory began to circulate among the detectives that the victim was not from Krakow at all. They suspected she might have been brought in from another city or even from across the border. The precision of the work suggested a killer who was calm, patient, and highly skilled. This was not a crime of passion or a sudden outburst of violence. It was a project that had been completed with the coldness of a scientist. As the weeks turned into months, the state media was instructed to stop reporting on the case. The government did not want the public to know that a predator of this nature was walking the streets of a major socialist city. It was bad for morale and suggested a lack of control that the administration could not afford. The files were moved to a restricted archive, and the skin was placed in a jar of formaldehyde in a back room of the university. Stefan returned to his work on the river, but he was never the same man who had counted his fuel levels with such pride. He found himself looking at the surface of the water with a new kind of intensity, searching for pale shapes in the wake of his boat. He stopped drinking his coffee on the deck, preferring the cramped safety of the cabin. Every time the engine vibrated, he felt a jolt of panic in his chest, certain that the propeller had caught on another hollow person. The identity of the woman remained a mystery for decades, a nameless shadow in the history of Polish crime. There were no witnesses, no murder weapon, and no suspects who ever faced a judge. The case became a legend among the local police, a warning about the kind of darkness that can exist in a quiet, orderly city. It was as if someone had reached into the timeline of 1977 and removed a person, leaving only a pale shroud behind. In the late 90s, another case would emerge in the same river that bore a terrifying resemblance to what Stefan found. It suggested that the predator had never really left, or that someone had been studying the old files with a very specific intent. But for Stefan, the mystery ended on that freezing January morning. He retired a few years later and moved away from the water, unable to stand the sound of the ice knocking against a hull. The final report on the Vistula discovery noted that the skin was eventually destroyed during a laboratory fire in the 1980s. All of the physical evidence, the chemical analysis, and the original photographs vanished in the smoke. The state officially closed the file, citing a lack of leads in the passage of time. The woman who was peeled away from herself simply ceased to exist twice, once in life and once in the record. The Vistula River continues to flow through Krakow, a wide and silent witness to everything that is discarded in its depths. Most things that fall into the water eventually sink to the bottom and are covered by the silt. But occasionally, the current brings something back to the surface that was meant to stay hidden forever. Some things are removed with such care that you realize the person was never the point. The hollow weight of that discovery remained with Stefan until the day he died. A memory of a pale shape on a cold deck. It is a reminder that the world we see is often just a thin layer over something much more complex and much darker. But that was only the beginning of the secrets held by the rivers and coasts of Europe during that era. Thousands of miles away, on the white limestone cliffs of Denmark, another man was about to pull something from the water that defied every law of logic. In the summer of 1976, the white limestone cliffs of Stevens Klint rose out of the Baltic Sea like a wall of ancient bone. A fisherman named Eric was leaning against the wooden railing of his boat, the Marin, as he navigated the shallow waters just offshore. The sun was beginning to burn through the morning mist, turning the surface of the water into a sheet of hammered silver. Eric reached down to adjust the throttle, feeling the familiar vibration of the diesel engine beneath his palms. He was a man who lived by the rhythm of the tides and the migration of the herring. At 42 years old, Eric had spent more time on the water than he had on solid ground, and he preferred it that way. The Baltic was a cold and unforgiving place, but it was predictable if you knew how to read the clouds. He kept his deck scrubbed clean and his nets mended with a precision that bordered on obsession. The fishing industry in Denmark was changing, and the pressure to bring in a larger catch was a constant weight on his shoulders. Eric had a mortgage on the boat and a wife who worried every time the wind picked up from the east. He spent his days calculating the price of fuel against the weight of the crates, always looking for a way to stay ahead of the debt. It was a life of small margins and hard labor, but he found a quiet dignity in the work. Eric had a habit of whistling a specific folk song whenever he was alone on the water, a tune his father had taught him 30 years ago. He always kept a small piece of dried amber in his pocket for good luck, a habit that felt like a bridge to the men who had fished these waters for centuries. He was planning to take his youngest son out on the boat for the first time next weekend, a milestone he had been looking forward to all year. Every action he took was governed by a sense of duty to his family and his craft. He continued to scan the water for any sign of a school of fish or a change in the current. The sea was unusually calm that morning, with only a light swell that made the boat rock with a gentle, hypnotic motion. Eric noticed a cluster of seagulls hovering over a dark shape about 50 yards to his starboard side. At first, he thought it was a large piece of driftwood or perhaps a seal that had surfaced to breathe. He steered the Marin closer, his eyes narrowing against the glare of the reflected sunlight. As he approached, the shape didn't dive or move with the current like a living animal would. It was bobbing vertically in the water, appearing and disappearing with the rhythm of the waves. Eric cut the engine, and the sudden silence of the open sea felt heavy and expectant. The water was so clear that he could see several feet below the surface. He leaned over the rail, his hands gripping the wood so hard his knuckles turned white. The dark shape was not wood or a seal, but the back of a man's head, with short, dark hair that swayed in the current like seagrass. The man was floating upright, his shoulders square and his arms at his sides as if he were standing on the seabed. Eric reached for his long-handled boat hook, his movements slow and deliberate. He caught the fabric of the man's clothing and began to pull him toward the side of the boat. The weight was immense, far heavier than any drowning victim he had ever encountered in his career. The resistance was not just from the water, but from something inside the man's clothes that refused to let him rise. The rough wood of the boat hook groaned under the tension as Eric hauled the figure upward. The smell of the salt spray was suddenly cut by a cold, metallic scent that seemed to rise directly from the body. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic rhythm that made his vision blur at the edges. He had to get this person out of the water. He had to see the face. He had to understand why the sea was holding on to him so tightly. He gave one final, desperate heave, and the man's torso broke the surface of the water with a wet, heavy slap. Eric gasped and stepped back, nearly losing his balance on the slick deck. The man was not wearing a swimsuit or a sweater or the rugged gear of a sailor. He was dressed in a high-end, black tuxedo, with a crisp white shirt and a silk bow tie that was still perfectly knotted. Eric stood frozen, looking down at the impeccably dressed stranger lying on his deck. The man appeared to be in his late 30s or early 40s, with a face that looked calm, almost as if he were sleeping. His skin was pale and waxy from the water, but there were no signs of injury or struggle. The tuxedo was made of fine wool that looked expensive even when soaked through with Baltic brine. He knelt beside the body and noticed that the man's pockets were bulging with heavy, irregular shapes. Eric reached into the right jacket pocket and pulled out a handful of smooth, dark flints. He checked the other pockets and found more of the same stones, all of them carefully placed to distribute the weight evenly. He realized that the man had been turned into a human anchor, designed to stay at the bottom of the ocean forever. The fisherman radioed the harbor master in Rudvig, his voice shaking as he reported the discovery. Within an hour, a police boat and a naval vessel had arrived at the scene, cordoning off the area around Stevens Clint. The authorities didn't treat the situation like a typical accident or a suicide. They moved with a clinical, quiet efficiency that suggested they were dealing with something far more complicated. The body was taken to a secure facility in Copenhagen for a full forensic examination. The lead investigator, a man who refused to give his name, spent hours documenting the tuxedo and the stones. He discovered that every single label had been meticulously unpicked from the clothing using a razor or a very sharp knife. There was no brand name, no size tag, and no dry cleaning mark to indicate where the suit had been purchased. The most shocking detail emerged when the stones were sent to a laboratory for geological analysis. The flints found in the man's pockets did not originate from the cliffs of Stevens Clint or anywhere else in Denmark. They were a specific type of high-density stone found only on the southern coast of England, more than 500 miles away. Someone had transported these stones across international borders specifically to sink this man in Danish waters. The investigators checked the man's teeth and found a silver filling of a type that had not been used in Western Europe for over 20 years. It was a specific alloy common in the Eastern Bloc countries, particularly in East Germany and Poland. The theory began to form that the man was a high-level defector or a spy who had been caught in a botched exchange. He had been erased from his own life and dropped into the sea like a piece of unwanted cargo. A local resident later came forward to report seeing a sleek, black boat without lights hovering near the cliffs the night before the discovery. The boat had moved with a speed that suggested it was powered by high-performance engines, far beyond anything owned by the local fishing fleet. But there were no radar pings and no official record of any vessel in that area. It was as if the boat, like the man in the tuxedo, had never truly existed. The Danish police contacted Interpol and sent the man's descriptions to every intelligence agency in Europe. They looked for missing businessmen, politicians, and diplomats, but no one matched the profile. The man remained a ghost, a nameless figure who had been dressed for a gala and then sent to his grave in the cold Baltic silt. The precision of the execution suggested a professional organization with unlimited resources. As the weeks passed, the investigation began to stall under the weight of the unknown. There was no family to claim him, and no government willing to admit they knew who he was. The case was eventually classified as a cold file, and the man was buried in an unmarked grave in a small cemetery overlooking the sea. The files were locked away in a cabinet, and the public was told that the cause of death was an accidental drowning. Eric continued to fish near Stevens Clint, but he could never look at those white cliffs without seeing the dark shape in the water. He stopped whistling his father's song, finding that the silence of the sea now felt more like a threat than a comfort. He realized that the world he lived in was only a surface, and that beneath it, there were forces moving that he would never understand. Some secrets are meant to stay at the bottom of the ocean, weighted down by stones from a distant shore. The Sea-Walker, as he came to be known in local lore, remains one of Denmark's greatest mysteries. He was a man who was meticulously prepared for his own disappearance, ensuring that even his clothes would tell no stories. The identity of the person in the tuxedo and the reason for his elaborate execution died with him in the water. He was dressed for a celebration, but his final dance was a slow descent into the dark. The memory of the man bobbing in the current is a reminder that even the most beautiful landscapes can hide a cold and clinical horror. Thousands of miles away, in the humid markets of Singapore, another kind of predator was about to prove that a crowd is often the best place to hide a secret. A 9-year-old girl was about to step into a shadow that would never let her go. In October of 1977, the Geylang Serai wet market in Singapore was a riot of color and noise. Lim stood near a mountain of rambutans, his eyes scanning the fruit for the perfect bunch to bring home. The air was a thick, humid weight that smelled of fermented shrimp paste, raw poultry, and the sweet, cloying scent of overripe durian. Industrial fans hummed overhead, but they only succeeded in moving the hot, stagnant air around the crowded stalls. Lim wiped a bead of sweat from his upper lip with the back of his hand, feeling the grit of the city on his skin. He was a man of 42 who worked as a clerk in a government office, a job that required a quiet mind and an eye for detail. He spent his Saturday mornings navigating the organized chaos of the market, a routine that anchored his week. He knew every stallholder by their first name and which ones offered the best price for fresh pork or ginger. The market was the heartbeat of the kampong, a place where secrets were hard to keep because the community was always watching. Lim had lived in the same block of flats for 10 years and knew the 9-year-old girl who lived 3 doors down from his own apartment. She was a bright child who often ran errands for her mother, small tasks that gave her a sense of pride and independence. Earlier that morning, Lim had seen her skipping toward the fruit section with a few coins gripped tightly in her small hand. He had nodded to her, and she had given him a quick, toothy grin before disappearing into the thick of the crowd. His own life was a series of modest expectations and steady, predictable routines. He planned to spend the afternoon repairing a leaking pipe in his bathroom and then listening to the evening news on the radio while his wife cooked dinner. He took a quiet pride in his ability to predict the weather by the way the wind shifted over the Kalang River. He felt a deep sense of security in the stability of his neighborhood, believing that the close-knit community was a natural shield against the dangers of the outside world. He stopped at a stall to examine a row of pineapples, weighing each one in his palm to check for the telltale signs of ripeness. He always bought 3, 1 for his own family and 2 for his aging parents who lived on the other side of the city. It was a small gesture of filial piety that he never missed, a rhythmic part of his identity as a son and a provider. He was a man who believed that if you followed the rules and respected your neighbors, the world would remain in a state of perfect balance. The first strange detail appeared when he reached the edge of the market near the old concrete well. He saw the girl's mother standing by a vegetable stall, her face unusually pale and her eyes darting frantically between the passing faces. She wasn't buying anything, and she was clutching her purse so tightly that her knuckles were a stark, bloodless white. She looked at Lim and asked in a strained voice if he had seen her daughter return to the flats within the last hour. Lim told her he had seen the girl earlier, but the mother's panic did not subside. She explained that the girl was only supposed to buy a single bag of oranges and come straight back to the apartment. An hour was far too long for such a simple task in a space the child knew by heart. Lim felt a slight chill despite the oppressive heat, a small crack in the morning's normalcy that he could not immediately explain away. He offered to walk back toward the fruit stalls to see if she had been distracted by a street performer or a stray cat. He retraced his steps through the aisles, calling the girl's name softly at first. Then, with more urgency, as he realized no one had seen her for over 30 minutes. The stall holders shook their heads, their faces reflecting a growing unease that began to mirror his own. The busy market suddenly felt different, the noise of the haggling voices turning into a discordant and threatening roar. He reached the back of the market where the shadows were deeper and the air was strangely still. Near the base of the concrete well, he saw something that made him stop in his tracks. 2 small rubber slippers were placed side by side on the damp ground, perfectly aligned as if someone had tucked them in for the night. They were exactly like the ones the girl had been wearing when she smiled at him earlier that morning. There was no sign of a struggle, no scuff marks in the dirt, and no other items of clothing were found nearby. Lim stepped closer, the smell of damp stone and stagnant water rising from the well's dark mouth. The concrete was cool and slick under his fingertips, a sharp and sudden contrast to the baking heat of the market just a few yards away. He looked down into the dark circle, his own shadow cutting across the opening like a heavy shroud. The pressure in his chest tightened until it felt like his ribs might snap, and he realized with a sudden, cold clarity that the girl was not lost. She was being kept. He shouted for help, and within minutes, a group of men had gathered around the well with powerful flashlights. They shone the beams down into the water, but the surface was clear and completely undisturbed. A local police officer arrived and climbed down into the well using a rope, searching every inch of the concrete walls and the shallow, silty bottom, He eventually came back up and told the gathered crowd that the well was entirely empty. The search expanded to the entire district, with hundreds of volunteers scouring the alleyways and abandoned buildings as the sun began to set. Lim stayed out until 3 in the morning, his legs aching and his voice hoarse from calling her name into the darkness. He kept thinking about the slippers and the way they had been placed with such deliberate care. It felt like a message, a cold and calculated act of staging that defied the chaotic nature of the wet market. The next day, the search returned to the market, which had been cordoned off by the authorities and filled with uniformed officers. Every stall was searched, every wooden crate was overturned, and the well was checked for a second time by a specialized dive team. They found nothing but a few old coins and some rusted metal at the bottom of the shaft. The police began to focus on the theory that the girl had been snatched and taken out of the city in a vehicle. On the third day, the air in Singapore turned heavy with the promise of a sudden monsoon rain. Lim was walking past the well on his way to check the community center when he noticed a strange scent in the shifting wind. It was not the smell of the market or the stagnant water he had noticed before. It was the distinct and artificial scent of expensive floral soap, the kind his wife only used for special occasions and kept hidden in a velvet box. He walked toward the well, his movements mechanical and stiff, as if he were moving through deep water. The area was quiet now, the shoppers and vendors having been cleared away by the ongoing police investigation. He leaned over the edge and looked down, expecting to see the same dark, empty circle he had seen twice before. Instead, he saw a flash of brilliant white at the bottom, a clean and vibrant color that stood out against the gray. Mosu stone. He did not scream this time. He simply stood there as the first heavy drops of rain began to fall against the concrete. The police returned and lowered a heavy basket into the well, pulling up the body of the 9-year-old girl. She was wearing the same white dress she had disappeared in, but it was pristine, without a single speck of dirt or a drop of blood. Her hair had been brushed and tied back with a brand new silk ribbon. The medical examiner's report was a series of cold, impossible facts that the community struggled to process in the following weeks. The girl had been dead for less than 6 hours, meaning she had been kept alive somewhere nearby for nearly 3 days. There were no signs of physical trauma other than the faint marks on her neck where she had been strangled. Most chillingly, her body had been thoroughly bathed and dressed in clean clothes just before she was placed in the well. The investigation revealed that she had been placed in the well while the search parties were still active in the surrounding streets. The killer had managed to move a child, clean her, dress her, and deposit her in a high-traffic location without a single person seeing him. This meant the predator was not a stranger passing through the city. It was someone who lived there, someone who knew the schedule of the police and the exact movements of the volunteers. Lim realized that the person who had done this had likely been standing right next to him during the long nights of the search. They might have been the one who held the flashlight or the one who offered a bottle of water to the grieving mother. The cleanliness of the body was not a sign of care or remorse, but a sign of total control. The killer had treated the girl like a doll, a project to be completed and then returned to the place where it began. Despite questioning over 100 people in the neighborhood, the police never found a single witness who saw anything unusual during those 3 days. The girl's slippers were never recovered after they were taken as evidence, and no one ever came forward with information about the origin of the floral soap. The case became a permanent scar on the history of the wet market, a reminder that the most dangerous person is often the one who looks the most ordinary. No one was ever charged with the murder, and the file was eventually moved to the cold case archives of the Singapore National Police. The well was ordered to be sealed and covered with a thick, permanent layer of reinforced concrete to prevent any further tragedies. For years afterward, shoppers would walk around the spot where the well used to be, instinctively giving the empty space a wide berth, as if they could still feel the cold rising from the ground. Lim moved out of the district 6 months after the funeral, unable to look at the fruit stalls without seeing the girl's toothy grin in his mind. He never fixed the leaking pipe in his bathroom, and he stopped listening to the evening news entirely. He spent the rest of his life wondering which of his neighbors had watched him cry at the edge of the well while holding a bag of oranges in their own hand. The market has since been demolished and replaced by a modern shopping complex. But the story of the girl in the well remains. It is a foundational trauma for the city. A case where the truth was hidden in plain sight and then returned with a terrifying, silent politeness. The predator did not hide in the deep shadows of the forest. He hid in the bright light of a Saturday morning. The final drop in the investigation was a small detail that was never released to the public at the time. Inside the girl's small pocket, the police found a single, small orange, perfectly peeled with the segments separated as if it were ready to be eaten by a child. It was a silent gesture from a killer who wanted everyone to know that he was still there, watching. The humid air of Singapore eventually gives way to the cooling rains of the monsoon, washing the streets clean of the day's dust and grime. But some things cannot be washed away by the rain or buried under a layer of concrete. The memory of that white dress at the bottom of the well remained with everyone who saw it, a cold weight in a hot city. This same kind of clinical, silent erasure was happening elsewhere, in places far more remote than a busy wet market. In the dense, quiet forests of Finland, a hiker was about to find a bright orange tent that held a secret just as sterile and just as terrifying. The world was beginning to feel like a place where identities could be unpicked as easily as the labels on a tuxedo. The silence of the trees was waiting to tell a story of a man who did not want to be found. In the late autumn of 1976, a man named Mikko was pushing through a dense thicket in the Korpilampi forest, about 20 miles northwest of Helsinki. The ground was a soft, damp carpet of moss and fallen pine needles that muffled the sound of his heavy hiking boots. Mikko was a man of 42 who worked in a quiet library in the city, and he spent his weekends seeking out the most isolated parts of the Finnish wilderness. He carried a leather rucksack and a small map, his only goal being to reach the shore of the lake before the sun dipped below the horizon. He was a man who lived by a strict personal code of silence and self-reliance. Every Friday evening, he would pack his gear with a rhythmic efficiency, checking his matches, his compass, and his small tin of coffee. He enjoyed the physical challenge of navigating the unmapped ridges and the way the cold air seemed to clear the dust of the city from his lungs. Mikko didn't hike for the view or the exercise, but for the feeling of being the only human soul for miles in any direction. He had a routine once he found a suitable campsite. He would first clear a small circle of earth, then arrange his stones for a fire, and finally sit on a fallen log to watch the shadows grow long across the silver birch trees. He was a creature of habit who appreciated the predictable cycles of the seasons. He had a wife and a young son back in Espoo, and he often thought about the life he was building for them while he sat in the deep silence of the woods. Before he reached the lake, Mikko decided to take a shortcut through a stand of spruce trees that had grown so thick they blocked out most of the afternoon light. He was an experienced woodsman who knew how to read the moss on the bark and the slope of the land to keep his bearings. He was already planning his breakfast for the next morning, a simple meal of porridge and black coffee, when he saw a flash of color that did not belong in the forest. It was a vibrant, artificial orange that stood out against the deep greens and grays of the wilderness. He slowed his pace, his curiosity replaced by a growing sense of unease. He found himself standing on the edge of a small, natural clearing that was hidden from the main trail by a wall of heavy branches. In the center of the clearing sat a pristine, high-quality tent, pitched with a level of precision that Mikko had rarely seen. The stakes were driven deep into the earth at perfect angles, and the rainfly was pulled so tight that there wasn't a single wrinkle in the fabric. The tent was completely silent, and there was no sign of a campfire, no discarded trash, and no gear left sitting outside. It looked like it had been dropped into the woods by a machine rather than carried in by a hiker. Mikko stood at the edge of the clearing for several minutes, waiting for the occupant to emerge or for the sound of movement from within. The only noise was the distant cry of a raven and the soft sigh of the wind through the spruce needles. He walked toward the orange fabric, his footsteps feeling unusually loud in the heavy stillness of the clearing. He called out a greeting in Finnish, but there was no response from inside the tent. He noticed that a layer of fine dust and a few dried leaves had settled on the top of the tent, suggesting it had been sitting in this exact spot for at least 2 or 3 weeks. He reached out with a trembling hand toward the heavy metal tab of the front entrance. The smell of damp, heavy canvas and cold pine needles filled the small space as the metal teeth of the zipper let out a sharp, rhythmic rasping sound. The air inside was stagnant and freezing, and as Mikko's fingers gripped the flap, he realized the person inside had not drawn a single breath in all the time he had been standing in the clearing. He felt a sudden, freezing certainty that he was unzipping a person's coffin rather than a traveler's tent. He pulled the flap wide and saw a man lying in a dark blue sleeping bag, his head resting on a small, inflatable pillow. The man appeared to be in his late 20s or early 30s, with fair hair and a face that was remarkably peaceful. He was lying on his back with his hands folded neatly over his chest, looking as though he had simply decided to take a nap and never woke up. There was no blood, no sign of a struggle, and no evidence of a predator. The man was dressed in expensive, high-quality outdoor clothing that looked almost brand new. Mikko backed out of the tent and stumbled toward the edge of the clearing, his heart hammering against his ribs. He didn't look back until he reached the main trail, where he ran for 2 miles until he found a group of forestry workers with a radio. Within 3 hours, the quiet clearing in Korpilampi was filled with police officers and forensic investigators from Helsinki. They moved with a clinical speed, cordoning off the trees and documenting the exact position of every item inside the orange tent. The lead investigator was a veteran detective who had seen dozens of suicides and accidents in the Finnish backcountry, but he immediately recognized that this case was different. He noticed that while the man had plenty of gear, there was no wallet, no passport, and no keys to be found anywhere in the clearing. As the forensic team began to process the man's belongings, they discovered a detail that sent a chill through the entire department. Every single identifying mark had been systematically removed from the man's life. The labels had been carefully sliced out of his jacket, his trousers, and his thermal underwear with a very sharp blade. The brand name on his boots had been filed down until the leather was smooth and anonymous. Even the small metal buttons on his shirt had been replaced with plain, unbranded versions. The killer, or the man himself, had gone to extraordinary lengths to ensure that no one would ever be able to trace where these items had been purchased. Inside the tent, the police found a small camping stove and a high-end Swiss watch sitting on a folding stool. When the horologist examined the watch, he found that the serial numbers on the internal movement had been meticulously scratched out with a needle. It was as if the owner wanted the watch to keep time, but he didn't want it to have a history. The man also possessed a pack of Ernte 23 cigarettes, a rare German brand that was not sold in Finland during the mid-70s. The autopsy revealed that the cause of death was poisoning by a sophisticated chemical compound that left almost no trace in the bloodstream. It was a substance that would have required a background in chemistry or pharmacology to obtain and administer. The man's dental work was of exceptionally high quality, featuring gold bridges and porcelain caps that were common among the wealthy elites of Western Europe or North America. Despite this, his fingerprints did not match any criminal or civil database in the Nordic countries. The investigators checked with every embassy in Helsinki, looking for reports of missing diplomats, businessmen, or students. They contacted the German authorities regarding the cigarettes and the Swiss police regarding the watch. But every lead ended in a dead wall of silence. No one had reported a man of this description missing, and no one came forward to claim the body. He was a man who had walked into the woods with the intent of becoming a ghost. A theory began to emerge that the man was a professional operative or a high-level courier who had been burned by his handlers. The staging of the campsite was too perfect, and the erasure of his identity was too clinical to be the work of a typical hiker. He had been placed in the Korpilampi forest because it was a place where a body could sit for weeks without being discovered. He was a ghost traveler who had been erased from the timeline of 1976. Mikko never went back to the Korpilampi forest, and he eventually sold his hiking gear and took up gardening in his small backyard. He found that he could no longer stand the sound of a zipper or the sight of the color orange against a green background. He spent the rest of his life wondering if the man in the tent had been a victim or a willing participant in his own disappearance. He had looked into the eyes of a person who had successfully unpicked the threads of his own existence. The man was eventually buried in a quiet plot in Espoo under a headstone that simply read, "Unknown." The orange tent was destroyed by the police after the investigation officially went cold in the early 80s. The file remains open in the archives of the Finnish National Bureau of Investigation. But there has not been a new lead in over 40 years. He remains a pristine mystery. A man who left the world exactly as he entered it, without a name. The silence of the Finnish woods eventually reclaimed the clearing, and the moss grew over the spot where the tent had been pitched. But for those who know the story, the orange fabric still flickers in the peripheral vision of the mind. Some people don't just want to die, they want to be erased. This same sense of an impossible 100. Silent disappearance was echoing across the world, even in the highest mountains on Earth. In the Langtang Valley of Nepal, another traveler was about to reach a small stone hut in a light dusting of snow. He would wave to his friends, step inside to rest, and then simply cease to be. The mountains, like the forests of Finland, were beginning to hold on to people and never let them go. The next story is one where the logic of the physical world seems to stop at the doorway of a mountain shelter. In the late afternoon of October 1976, a man named David was leaning into the wind on a high mountain pass in the Langtang Valley of Nepal. The air at 12,000 feet was so thin it felt like breathing through a layer of cold silk that burned the back of his throat. David was 24 years old and had spent the last 2 months leading a small group of Australian travelers through the rugged terrain of the Himalayas. He was a man who took a quiet pride in his ability to read the sky and calculate the exact amount of daylight remaining before a squall moved in. He was a natural leader who preferred the predictable physics of a climb over the chaotic energy of the city. David kept a small brass compass in his pocket that had belonged to his grandfather, and he checked it every hour with a rhythmic, mechanical devotion. He had a plan to return to Sydney in December to start a job in civil engineering, a career that mirrored his desire for structure and stability. On the trail, he was the one who managed the water rations and ensured that everyone in the group stayed within a visible distance of one another. The group was moving toward a well-known stone structure known as a resting hut, located just before a steep incline that led to the upper glacier. It was a simple building made of stacked slate and mud, designed to provide temporary shelter for trekkers caught in the unpredictable mountain weather. David's best friend, a 22-year-old named Mark, was the strongest climber in the group and had pushed about 200 yards ahead of the rest. Mark was a cheerful, energetic man who treated every mile of the trek like a personal victory over the landscape. David watched from the lower ridge as Mark reached the flat plateau where the stone hut sat against the backdrop of the gray peaks. Mark turned around and waved his ice axe in the air, his silhouette sharp and clear against the white clouds. He pointed toward the heavy wooden door of the shelter and gave a thumbs up, signaling that he was going inside to start a small fire before the others arrived. David waved back and checked his watch, noting that it was exactly 4:15 in the afternoon. As David continued his ascent, a light dusting of snow began to fall from the heavy, iron-colored clouds above. It was a dry, powdery snow that settled on the rocks like a thin layer of flour, covering the dark gray slate in a matter of minutes. The wind died down to a complete whisper, leaving the valley in a state of profound and heavy silence. David focused on the sound of his own rhythmic breathing and the crunch of his boots as he closed the gap between the ridge and the plateau. He reached the flat ground near the hut exactly 30 minutes after he had last seen Mark wave from the doorway. The new snow was pristine and completely undisturbed, creating a smooth, white carpet that stretched from the edge of the ridge to the walls of the stone shelter. David stopped 10 feet from the door, his eyes scanning the ground for the deep, heavy boot prints that Mark should have left behind. There were no tracks leading toward the hut, and more importantly, there were no tracks leading away from it into the higher passes. The wooden door was shut tight, its heavy iron latch glinting in the fading light of the mountain evening. David reached out and gripped the cold metal handle, feeling the grit of the frost against his bare palm. He pulled the door open, and the hinges let out a long gasp, low groan that seemed to echo inside his own chest. The air inside the hut was freezing and deathly still, carrying only the faint, dusty scent of old wool and wood smoke. He thought for a brief second that Mark was hiding in the corner to play a joke, a small flash of hope that was immediately crushed by the absolute lack of warmth in the room. The interior of the hut was a square room with a dirt floor and a small stone hearth in the center. It was entirely empty. There were no backpacks sitting on the benches, no discarded wrappers from the energy bars Mark liked to eat, and no sign that a fire had ever been started. David walked to the back wall and touched the stones, finding them as cold as the peaks outside. He looked at the ceiling and then back at the floor, his mind refusing to accept the visual evidence that his friend had simply ceased to exist in the 30 minutes it took to cross the plateau. He walked back outside and began to circle the building, his movements becoming frantic as the light continued to fail. He checked the narrow space between the hut and the cliff face, but the snow there was also untouched and smooth. There were no crevices in the ground large enough to swallow a man, and the slope of the mountain was too steep for Mark to have climbed without leaving a trail. David stood in the center of the plateau and shouted his friend's name until his voice cracked, but the only response was the distant, hollow rumble of an avalanche miles away. The rest of the group arrived 10 minutes later, and they spent the next 4 hours scouring the immediate area with high-powered flashlights. They moved in a tight line, checking every rock and every shadow, but the mountain offered no clues. The light snow had stopped, leaving the landscape in a state of perfect, terrifying preservation. It was as if Mark had stepped through the doorway of the hut and right off the edge of the world. The following morning, a team of 50 local villagers and several government helicopters joined the search, covering a 10-mile radius around the Langtang shelter. They checked the deep valleys below the plateau and the high ridges above, but they found no discarded gear and no sign of a struggle. The police in Kathmandu opened an official investigation, but they were hampered by the remote location and the lack of physical evidence. There were no reports of criminal activity in the area at the time, and the local Sherpas were as baffled as the Australian trekkers. One theory suggested by the local authorities was that the disappearance was linked to the illicit cross-border trade that occasionally moved through the high passes. They suspected that Mark might have stumbled upon a group of smugglers using the hut as a cache and had been forcibly removed to prevent him from talking. However, this did not explain the lack of tracks in the fresh snow or the fact that Mark's heavy rucksack had also vanished without a trace. A group of men and a captive traveler cannot move across a snowy plateau without leaving a single mark on the ground. Another possibility was that Mark had fallen into a hidden crevasse that had been opened by a recent tremor and then covered by the light snowfall. But the search teams found no such openings in the solid rock of the plateau, and the hut itself sat on a foundation of stable granite. The logic of the physical world seemed to have suspended itself for a single half hour on that October afternoon. Mystery should widen before it narrows, and in this case, every new search only served to make the disappearance feel more impossible. The investigation lasted for 3 months before the Nepalese government officially declared Mark a missing person and closed the active file. David remained in the country for another 6 weeks, hiring private guides to take him back to the Langtang Valley 3 separate times. He stood in the doorway of the hut and measured the distance to the ridge, trying to find a flaw in his own memory or a path he might have missed. He eventually realized that he wasn't looking for a person anymore, but for a reason that the world could break in such a quiet way. The Australian Department of Foreign Affairs kept the case on their books for decades, but no remains were ever recovered and no witnesses ever came forward. Mark's family held a memorial service in Sydney, leaving an empty chair at the front of the room to represent the son who never came home. The The disappearance became a part of the local folklore in the Langtang Valley, with some villagers claiming the mountain spirits had claimed a golden traveler. But David knew that spirits did not take rucksacks or ice axes. David never took up his engineering job in Sydney, finding that the structured life he once craved now felt like a fragile illusion. He spent the rest of his career working in search and rescue, obsessed with the idea that every missing person leaves a trail if you look hard enough. He never returned to Nepal, and he never again walked into a building without looking at the ground behind him first. He was a man haunted by the image of a friend waving from a doorway that led to nowhere. The stone hut in the Langtang Valley eventually collapsed under the weight of a heavy winter storm in the late 80s. The slate and mud were reclaimed by the earth, leaving only a flat, unremarkable plateau where the building used to stand. The fresh snow still falls every October, covering the gray rocks in a pristine, white sheet that hides the memory of 1976. The mountain does not take people, it just holds the space where they used to be. The final drop in the file was a small detail noted by one of the searchers on the second day of the operation. He found a small tuft of blue wool snagged on the rough bark of a stunted tree 50 yards below the plateau, in an area that was completely inaccessible by foot. It was the exact color of the sweater Mark had been wearing under his jacket. There were no mud leading to the tree, and the wool was hanging 6 feet above the ground, as if it had been dropped from the sky. The thin air of the Himalayas eventually carries all sounds away, leaving only the silence of the high peaks and the shifting of the glaciers. But the mystery of the impossible tracks remained with David until his final day. A cold weight that no amount of logic could lift. That same sense of a life being interrupted by an invisible force was being felt in the high deserts of South America. 2 French travelers were about to reach a military checkpoint where the dust of the road would swallow them whole. In July of 1976, Jean-Pierre was sitting on a dusty wooden bench inside a bus that was rattling through the Quebrada de Humahuaca in northern Argentina. He took a handkerchief from his pocket and wiped a thick layer of grit from the lenses of his glasses, squinting out at the jagged, multicolored mountains of the Andes. The air inside the cabin was a heavy mixture of diesel fumes and the scent of dry earth. Jean-Pierre was 26 years old and had been traveling through South America for 3 months, documenting the landscapes of the high desert in a series of leather-bound journals. He was a man who preferred the slow pace of overland travel, finding a quiet satisfaction in the way the colors of the earth shifted from deep red to pale ochre as the sun moved across the sky. Jean-Pierre had a habit of checking his watch every time the bus crossed a dry riverbed, a rhythmic way of measuring the vastness of the landscape. He was traveling with his partner, Françoise, who was currently resting her head on his shoulder, her eyes closed against the glare of the afternoon sun. They were both French citizens on a sabbatical year, moving toward the Bolivian border with a sense of freedom that only exists when you are thousands of miles from home. Jean-Pierre was an architect by training, a man who viewed the world in terms of structure and stability. He kept his camera in a specialized padded bag at his feet, treating it with more care than his own clothing. He spent his quiet moments on the bus, sketching the ruins of old colonial churches they passed along the road, obsessing over the exact curve of a bell tower or the thickness of an adobe wall. He had a small scar on his left thumb from a modeling knife, a permanent reminder of his life back in Paris that felt increasingly distant with every mile they traveled north. They were living on a strict budget, calculating the cost of every meal and every hostel bed in a small notebook they shared. Before leaving Salta, they had made a plan to reach the border town of La Quiaca by nightfall, a goal that required the bus to maintain a steady pace through the mountain passes. Jean-Pierre found a strange comfort in the shared goals of the other passengers, mostly local farmers and tradespeople who viewed the 2 Europeans with a mixture of curiosity and polite indifference. He felt a deep sense of security in the fact that they were foreigners with valid passports and no connection to the political turmoil brewing in the cities. The bus continued its slow ascent into the high desert, the engine groaning as the air became thinner and the vegetation disappeared entirely. Jean-Pierre noticed that Françoise was humming a soft melody under her breath, a habit she had whenever she was half asleep. He reached down to touch the strap of his camera bag, checking the buckles for the third time that hour. They were planning to spend the next month in the salt flats of Bolivia, a near-future expectation that kept their spirits high despite the growing heat and the discomfort of the bumpy road. The first strange detail appeared when the bus rounded a sharp bend and came to an abrupt halt in front of a series of low, concrete barriers. This was a military checkpoint, a common sight in Argentina during the mid-70s. But this one felt different from the ones they had passed earlier. There were 4 soldiers standing in the road, all of them carrying automatic rifles and wearing heavy olive-drab uniforms that looked far too warm for the desert sun. One of the soldiers gestured for the driver to cut the engine, and the sudden silence that followed was so heavy it made Jean-Pierre's ears ring. A young sergeant with a nervous, twitchy expression climbed onto the bus and began to walk down the narrow aisle, demanding to see the identification of every passenger. He didn't just glance at the papers, he held them up to the light and studied the faces of the locals with a cold, searching intensity. When he reached the middle of the bus, he stopped and looked at Jean-Pierre and Françoise. He didn't ask for their names, but simply pointed at their backpacks and signaled for them to follow him outside. Jean-Pierre stood up and felt the dry, searing heat of the sun on the back of his neck as he stepped onto the gravel. The smell of diesel and parched sage was overwhelming, and the silence of the mountains felt like a physical pressure against his chest. The sergeant placed his hand on the holster at his hip, his eyes fixed on the 2 French passports in his other hand. Jean-Pierre looked at Françoise and saw the same sudden, freezing realization in her eyes that he felt in his own heart. We are not just tourists anymore. They were led into a small, windowless concrete building near the barriers, while the rest of the passengers remained on the bus. The sergeant told them this was a routine verification of their entry stamps and that it would only take a few minutes. Jean-Pierre tried to maintain his professional, architectural calm, explaining in broken Spanish that they were merely travelers on their way to the border. But the sergeant wasn't listening. He was looking through Jean-Pierre's journals, turning the pages with a rough, impatient hand that tore the edges of the sketches. The door to the room was shut, and a heavy iron bolt was slid into place from the outside. Jean-Pierre heard the sound of the bus engine starting up again, the low rumble vibrating through the concrete floor beneath his boots. He ran to the small, barred window and watched as the vehicle pulled away, disappearing into a cloud of dust as it continued toward the north. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow that they were now alone in the middle of the high desert with no one to witness what happened next. The point of no return had passed the moment the bus vanished over the horizon. Jean-Pierre and Françoise were held in the small room for several hours as the temperature dropped and the shadows of the peaks stretched across the valley. They still tried to interpret the events using the logic of a world that respected international law and the rights of a foreign citizen. They assumed there had been a misunderstanding with their paperwork, or that the soldiers were looking for a bribe that they would eventually be allowed to pay. The escalation began when the sergeant returned with a superior officer, a man who wore no name tag and spoke in a low, monotone voice. He didn't ask about their passports or their travel plans. He wanted to know why they were taking photographs of the mountain passes and what they had seen at a specific abandoned mining facility 20 miles back. Jean-Pierre explained that he was an architect interested in old buildings, but the officer simply slapped the leather journal onto the table and said that the sketches looked like maps of military importance. The logic of being a protected traveler broke entirely when the officer grabbed Françoise by the arm and pulled her toward a separate room. Jean-Pierre tried to intervene, but the sergeant struck him across the face with the butt of his rifle, sending him sprawling against the cold concrete wall. He realized then that the entire nature of their problem had been misunderstood from the start. They hadn't been stopped because of their papers. They had been stopped because they had accidentally seen something they were never supposed to see in a country currently at war with its own people. The reconstruction of what happened after that night comes from a series of declassified French diplomatic cables and the testimonies of a few soldiers who broke their silence decades later. The French embassy in Buenos Aires began to pressure the Argentine government for information about the missing couple within 2 weeks of their disappearance. The authorities responded with a wall of silence, claiming that there was no record of the French tourists ever reaching the checkpoint. They suggested that the couple had likely decided to stay in the mountains or had been robbed by local bandits. A diplomat named Monsieur Roux spent months traveling through the Salta province, interviewing bus drivers and stallholders who might have seen the couple. He found the driver of the bus, who confirmed that 2 foreigners had been taken off the vehicle by the military and never returned. However, when the police visited the driver the next day, he retracted his statement, claiming he was tired and confused and that the foreigners had actually got off at a regular stop. Every lead the diplomat followed was met with a calculated erasure of the facts. The investigation hit a dead end in the late 70s. As the military dictatorship tightened its grip on information, the families of Jean-Pierre and Françoise in Paris were left with nothing but a set of empty rooms and the fading memory of a sabbatical year that never ended. The case was categorized as a mysterious disappearance, a tragic but common outcome in a region known for its harsh terrain. It wasn't until the 1990s, after the fall of the regime, that the truth began to crack the surface of the desert. The twist arrived through a former conscript who had been stationed at the Quebrada checkpoint in 1976. He revealed that the abandoned mine Jean-Pierre had been sketching was actually a clandestine detention center used by the 5th Army Corps. The couple had inadvertently documented the location of a site where political prisoners were being held and executed. When the soldiers saw the sketches in the journal, they didn't see art. They saw evidence that could prove the existence of a facility the state denied was there. The climax of the mystery occurred when a local investigator discovered 2 worn, blue rucksacks in the storage room of a provincial police station. They were covered in 20 years of dust, but inside one of them was a specialized camera bag and a leather journal with torn pages. For a brief moment, it seemed that the physical proof of the couple's fate had finally been found. However, before a forensic team could arrive from the city to process the items, the police station reported a suspicious fire that started in the evidence locker, destroying everything inside. The final verdict on the case of the French tourists is one of state-sanctioned murder, followed by a meticulous logistical erasure. They were officially recognized as victims of the Argentine Dirty War. Though their bodies have never been recovered from the arid landscape, the soldiers involved were never charged, as the records of that specific checkpoint were lost or intentionally shredded during the transition to democracy. Jean-Pierre and Françoise did not vanish in the mountains. They vanished in a system designed to make people stop existing. They remain 2 of the thousands of ghosts that haunt the high passes of the Andes. Names on a list that continues to grow as more archives are opened. The multicolored peaks of the Quebrada de Humahuaca are still beautiful, but they hold a silence that is no longer peaceful. The dust of the road eventually settles on everything, covering the truth until it is indistinguishable from the earth itself. Jean-Pierre's architectural mind would have understood the permanence of those concrete barriers, but he could never have designed a structure meant to bury the living. The final drop in the file is a single photograph that was recovered from a different source years later, taken by a local who didn't realize its significance. It shows a military truck driving away from the checkpoint on a cold July night, the headlights cutting through the darkness of the mountain pass. In the back of the truck, there is a flash of something pale and out of place, a small white handkerchief fluttering in the wind. The truck disappears into the shadows, leaving behind nothing but the cold air and the sound of the engine fading into the distance. The silence of the high desert eventually gives way to the gentle, rolling hills of a very different landscape. Across the world, in a small town in New Zealand, the sun was setting on a New Year's Eve that was supposed to be a celebration of new beginnings. But for a 15-year-old girl and her dog, the quiet streets of Ashburton were about to become a maze where the exit had been removed. The next story is one where the danger is not a state secret. but an invisible hand that reaches out from the familiar safety of home. Late afternoon on December 31st, 1977, Ashburton, New Zealand. Jill stood in her kitchen, the linoleum cool beneath her feet, reaching for a ceramic teapot. Outside, the summer sun was beginning to slant across the manicured lawns of the quiet neighborhood. Kirsty was 15 years old, a girl with a predictable spirit and a love for her black Labrador. Abby. She had mentioned she was going for a quick walk down toward the Ashburton River before the evening festivities began. Jill heard the back door click shut and the familiar jingle of the dog's collar as they headed out. The house was filled with the mundane sounds of a family preparing for the new year. Jill listened to the distant hum of a lawnmower and the occasional car passing on the street outside. She set the table for dinner, placing the forks and knives with a practiced, rhythmic motion she had performed 1,000 times before. New Year's Eve in a small town like Ashburton felt permanent and secure. Everyone knew which houses had the best gardens and which neighbors would be hosting the loudest parties. Jill expected the next few hours to unfold with the same gentle reliability that had governed her life for decades. She had already laid out a clean dress for Kirsty and made a mental note to remind her daughter to check the mail before the post office closed for the holiday. These small, near-future expectations were the fabric of her day. Kirsty was a girl who appreciated routine, never staying out past her dinner time without calling home first. Jill checked the clock on the wall, a round plastic face that ticked with a steady, comforting beat. It was nearly 6 o'clock, and the kettle began to whistle on the stove, a sharp sound that filled the small kitchen. She turned off the heat and waited for the back door to open, signaling that the walk was over. She heard a scratching sound at the screen door, followed by a low, insistent whine. Jill smiled, thinking that Abby was simply impatient for her dinner as usual. She walked to the door and pushed it open, expecting to see her daughter's face and hear a quick apology for being a few minutes late. Instead, the black Labrador pushed past her legs and ran straight to her water bowl in the corner of the kitchen. The dog was panting heavily, her fur matted with bits of dried grass and river silt. Jill looked out into the yard, expecting to see Kirsty trailing behind, perhaps stopped to talk to a friend at the gate. The yard was completely empty, and the gate was swinging slowly on its hinges with a rhythmic creak. Jill walked onto the porch, the warm evening air suddenly feeling thin and fragile against her skin. She called out her daughter's name, but the only response was the distant laughter of a neighbor starting a barbecue. She looked down at the dog and noticed that Abby was still wearing her heavy leather leash. The long strap was trailing behind her. Catching on the edge of the doorframe, Jill reached down to unclip it, her fingers brushing against the familiar texture of the weathered leather. The leather was slick with a cold, oily moisture that didn't feel like river water. As she gripped the leash, she felt the sudden, sharp tension of a heavy knot tied halfway down the length of the strap. She pulled it closer to her face and realized it was a complex maritime hitch, a knot that required 2 hands and a specific knowledge of rope work to execute. Her daughter didn't know how to tie anything more complicated than a shoelace. Jill felt a cold weight settle in the pit of her stomach, a physical sensation that made her breath catch in her throat. She looked toward the river path, seeing the long shadows of the trees stretching like fingers across the road. The silence of the house behind her was no longer a comfort, it was a vacuum. She walked to the end of the driveway, her movement stiff and mechanical as she scanned the sidewalk in both directions. The neighborhood was bathed in a beautiful, golden light that seemed to mock the sudden, sharp panic rising in her chest. She realized that the gate hadn't just been left open, it had been pushed wide by something moving with a great deal of force. Her husband, Sid, came out of the garage, wiping grease from his hands with a rag. Jill showed him the leash and the strange, professional knot, and the look on his face confirmed her own terror. They didn't call the neighbors first. They went straight to the telephone in the hallway and dialed the local police station. The escalation happened in the space between the sunset and the first stars appearing over the Canterbury Plains. The quiet streets were suddenly filled with the headlights of patrol cars and the voices of men calling out into the darkness. Jill stood on her front lawn, watching as the familiar safety of her world was dismantled piece by piece. The initial search focused on the riverbank, a place where teenagers often gathered to skip stones or sit in the tall grass. Police found Kirsty's lime green underpants and a single shoe near the water's edge the following morning. The items were not scattered or torn, but appeared to have been placed there with a strange, deliberate intent. The investigation took on a colder, more reconstructive tone as the days turned into weeks without a single sighting of the girl. Detectives interviewed hundreds of residents, looking for a drifter or a stranger who might have been seen in the area on New Year's Eve. They focused heavily on the knot in the leash, believing it was a signature left by someone with experience in farming or the merchant navy. Suspicion began to turn inward, as it often does in small, isolated communities where everyone feels they have a right to the truth. Neighbors who had known the family for years began to look at Sid and Jill with a new kind of scrutiny. The logic of the town broke down, replaced by an atmosphere of fear and whispered accusations. Every theory the police pursued seemed to lead to a dead end. They checked the registration of every green van seen in Ashburton that day, and they tracked down every known offender in the region. Mystery widened as the lack of physical evidence suggested a killer who was either incredibly lucky or meticulously careful. On January 17, 1978, a group of hikers was moving through the scrubland at Rakaya Gorge, about 40 kilometers from Ashburton. The area was rugged and beautiful, with steep limestone cliffs and the turquoise waters of the river below. They noticed something out of place in a patch of dense gorse bushes near the trail. Kirsty's body was found lying in the shade of the bushes. Protected from the harsh summer sun, she had been killed by a single, massive blow to the head that would have caused almost instant death. But the detail that stopped the investigators in their tracks was the condition of the remains. The 15-year-old girl was fully clothed in the dress her mother had laid out for her weeks before. Her clothing was neat and carefully adjusted, as if someone had taken the time to dress her after she had passed away. There were no signs of the typical violence associated with a random abduction. The twist in the case was the level of care taken by the person who had taken her. The body had been placed in a strangely specific, almost ritualistic position that suggested an emotional connection to the victim. It was the work of someone who didn't want her to be found for a long time, but also didn't want her to be exposed to the elements. Forensic technology in the late 70s was not advanced enough to produce a DNA profile from the scene. The police had a body and a cause of death, but they had no weapon and no clear motive that linked Kirsty to a specific predator. The care taken with the body only served to make the crime feel more personal and more terrifying. A local man who lived near the gorge was questioned multiple times, as he had been seen in the area with a green van on the day of the disappearance. He had a history of minor rope work and lived a solitary life on the edges of the community. However, there was never enough evidence to bring a formal charge against him. The verdict of the coroner was a cold summary of a life interrupted by a stranger. Kirsty Bentley had been murdered by a person or persons unknown, using a blunt instrument that was never recovered. The file remained open, but the momentum of the investigation began to slow as the years turned into decades. The aftershock in Ashburton lasted for a generation, changing the way parents viewed the safety of their own backyards. People began to lock their doors for the first time, and the sight of a dog returning home alone became a source of genuine dread. The quiet New Zealand town was no longer a sanctuary. It was a place where a girl could vanish in broad daylight. In 2022, the New Zealand police offered a reward of $100,000 for any information that could lead to an arrest. They hoped that the passage of time would loosen the tongue of someone who had been keeping a secret for nearly 50 years. But the streets of Ashburton remained silent, and the mystery of the invisible abductor stayed locked in the past. Jill and Sid eventually moved away from the house with the swinging gate, unable to bear the weight of the memories. They left behind a community that was forever haunted by the image of a black dog trailing a leather leash. The The truth was buried somewhere in the gorse bushes of the Rakaya Gorge, under a layer of summer dust. The final drop in the story is a small object that Jill kept in a wooden box on her nightstand for the rest of her life. It was a single, small photograph of Kirsty taken on Christmas Day, just 1 week before she vanished. In the photo, Kirsty is laughing at something off camera, her hand resting gently on the head of her dog. The memory of that laughter is the heaviest echo of a life that was taken by an invisible hand. It reminds us that the people we love can be standing right beside us one moment and gone the next, leaving behind only a trailing leash and a knot that no one can untie. The darkness doesn't always come from the mountains or the sea. Sometimes it waits on a suburban sidewalk. That same sense of a young life being hidden away was being felt in the cold forests of the Netherlands. On a Christmas day that should have been filled with light, a group of hikers was about to find a heavy trunk sitting among the pines. Inside was another girl who had been taken from the world, a lost soul who had no name and no home to return to. The bridge from a small town in New Zealand to a forest in Tetteringen is built from the same kind of silent, tragic mystery. Both cases involve a person found in a place they were never meant to be, staged by a hand that wanted them to remain a secret. Another kind of darkness is waiting ahead in the shadows of the Dutch pines. On the morning of December 25th, 1977, a man named Hans was walking through the Tetteringen woods in the southern part of the Netherlands. The air was brittle and cold, with a frost that had turned the pine needles into silver needles. Hans was 34 years old and worked as a clerk at a local shipping company, a job that required him to be indoors for 40 hours a week. He used his holiday mornings to escape the noise of his extended family and the heavy, humid heat of the Christmas kitchen. He was a man who valued the silence of the forest above almost anything else. Hans had a routine of walking the same 3-mile loop every weekend, a path that took him past a small creek and through a stand of ancient, towering pines. He found that the rhythmic crunch of his boots on the frozen ground helped him organize his thoughts for the coming year. He was a creature of habit who wore the same heavy wool coat every winter and carried a small wooden walking stick he had carved himself. His life was defined by the predictable cycles of the Dutch seasons and the responsibilities of his middle management role. He had a wife and 2 young sons who were currently back at the house, waiting for him to return so they could open their gifts. Hans felt a quiet pressure to provide a perfect holiday for his family, a stress that he usually managed by losing himself in the vastness of the woods. He looked forward to the afternoon when he could sit by the fire and listen to the wind rattling the window panes. He was moving through a section of the forest where the trees grew so close together that the light was a dim, watery green even at midday. Hans usually kept to the narrow dirt trail, but that morning he decided to cut through a thicket of gorse to see if the creek had frozen over. He was an experienced hiker who knew how to navigate the terrain without a map, relying on the slant of the light and the position of the sun. He was already thinking about the warm meal waiting for him at home when he saw something that broke the natural lines of the forest. Nestled between the roots of a massive pine tree was a large, heavy trunk made of dark brown leather. It was a high-quality piece of luggage, the kind used by wealthy travelers for long journeys across the continent. It sat perfectly level on the forest floor, as if it had been placed there with a great deal of care rather than tossed from a moving vehicle. Hans stopped 10 feet away, his breath blooming in white clouds as he stared at the incongruous object. The trunk was entirely silent, and the surrounding ground was undisturbed by any recent tracks or signs of a struggle. It looked like it had been part of the landscape for several weeks, with a fine layer of pine needles and dust coating the lid. Hans walked closer, his curiosity beginning to outweigh the peacefulness of his morning walk. He noticed that the brass latches were tarnished by the damp air, but remained firmly locked in place. He reached out and gripped the heavy leather handle on the side, intending to drag the trunk toward the trail so he could report it to the authorities. The frozen pine needles crunched under his boots, and the sharp, resinous scent of sap filled his lungs as he leaned his weight into the task. He pulled with all his strength, but the trunk didn't budge more than an inch, its mass feeling like a solid block of lead against the forest floor. His fingers began to ache from the cold, and a sudden, freezing thought bypassed his logic. This isn't filled with books or clothes. It is filled with something that used to have a heartbeat. He let go of the handle and backed away, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He didn't want to know what was inside, but he also knew he couldn't leave it there under the shadows of the pines. He turned and ran back toward the main road, his boots sliding on the icy patches of the trail. He found his brother waiting at the edge of the woods, and together they called the local police from a nearby farmhouse. The authorities arrived within 30 minutes, their blue lights flashing against the dark green backdrop of the Tetteringen woods. They moved with a clinical, quiet urgency, cordoning off the area and setting up a series of portable lights. A locksmith was brought in to pick the heavy brass latches, a process that took nearly 20 minutes in the freezing wind. When the lid finally creaked open, the seasoned officers stepped back, the silence of the forest replaced by a collective intake of breath. Inside the trunk, wrapped in a piece of heavy, patterned carpet, was the body of a young woman. She appeared to be between 15 and 25 years old, with dark hair and a face that had been preserved by the cold Dutch winter. She was lying in a fetal position, her hands tucked under her chin, as if she were trying to stay warm. She was wearing a handmade, colorful dress in the hippie style of the era, and a small silver ring with a distinctive green stone remained on her finger. The investigation moved from the woods to the morgue in Breda, where a team of forensic pathologists began the grim task of reconstructing her final days. They discovered that the woman was severely malnourished and had likely been held captive for weeks or even months before her death. There were faint marks on her wrists and ankles that suggested she had been restrained. The cause of death was eventually determined to be strangulation, a violent end to a life that had been systematically stripped of its dignity. The police checked every missing persons report in the Netherlands, but no one matched the description of the girl in the trunk. They expanded their search to Germany, Belgium, and France, believing that she might have been a traveler or a student from abroad. They released photographs of the handmade dress and the silver ring to the national newspapers, hoping that a friend or a family member would recognize the items. But the phones at the precinct remained silent, and the girl stayed nameless. The trunk itself was a mass-produced model sold in department stores across Europe, making it impossible to trace to a specific buyer. The piece of carpet she was wrapped in was a common variety found in thousands of Dutch homes during the 70s. Every lead the detectives followed seemed to dissolve into a dead end, leaving them with a victim who had no history and no voice. It was as if she had been erased from the world long before she was placed in the Tetteringen woods. Decades passed, and the case of the girl in the trunk became one of the most famous cold files in Dutch history. In the early 2000s, forensic isotope analysis was conducted on her teeth and bones, a technology that didn't exist when Hans first found her. The results suggested that the woman had likely grown up in Eastern Europe or the United Kingdom before moving to the Netherlands. This hinted at a tragic possibility she was a lost soul of the counterculture who had fallen into the hands of a predator while far from home. The twist in the investigation was the realization that the woman had never been reported missing in any country. This suggested that she had either been estranged from her family or that the people who knew her were also part of a world that avoided the authorities. She was a ghost who had walked through the cities of Europe without leaving a single footprint in the official records. The killer had chosen a victim who was already invisible, ensuring that no one would come looking for her. The climax of the mystery arrived in 2023, when Interpol included her in a major campaign called Identify Me. They released a digital reconstruction of her face and details of her case to a global audience, hoping that modern genealogy might finally give her a name. Thousands of tips poured in from across the world, but as of today, the girl in the trunk remains unidentified. She is buried in a quiet grave in Breda, her headstone marked only with a case number and the date she was found. The final verdict on the Tetteringen mystery is a cold summary of a life that was discarded like unwanted luggage. The person who killed her and placed her in the leather trunk has likely taken the secret to their own grave. The forest has since grown over the spot where Hans stood on that Christmas morning, and the massive pine tree has long since been cut down. The case remains a permanent shadow in the archives of the Dutch National Police, a story that refuses to be finished. The aftershock of the discovery stayed with Hans for the rest of his life, changing the way he viewed the silent places of the world. He never went back to the Tetteringen woods, and he eventually moved his family to a city where the streets were always crowded and bright. He found that he could no longer stand the sight of a leather suitcase or the smell of cold pine needles. He was a man who had looked into the empty space where a life used to be, and he found that the silence was too loud to bear. The final drop in the investigation is the silver ring with the green stone, which is still kept in a velvet-lined box in an evidence locker. It is a small, cheap piece of jewelry that likely meant the world to the girl who wore it. It sits there in the dark, waiting for someone to recognize it and call her home. But for now, she is just the girl in the trunk, a nameless echo of a Christmas day that went horribly wrong. The cold air of the Dutch forest eventually gives way to the industrial fog of a very different landscape. Across the border in Belgium, the city of Charleroi was a place of iron and coal, where the darkness was not in the trees but under the ground. Two teenage girls were about to walk into a mist that would lead them to a room where the walls were thick and the floor was covered in dust. The next story is one where the danger was built into the very foundation of the city, and the warning signs were ignored for far too long. November 1975. Charleroi, Belgium. Claire was pulling her wool coat tight as she stepped through the thick yellow mist that clung to the industrial streets. The fog in the Sambre Valley was so dense it felt like a physical weight, smelling of damp coal and cold iron. She was 16 years old and had lived in this neighborhood her entire life, knowing every crack in the sidewalk and every rusted gate by heart. She was walking home from a movie with her best friend, Sophie, who was huddled close to her side. They usually took the shortcut through the park, but the fog was so disorienting that they decided to stay on the main road where the streetlights provided a dim, watery glow. Claire was a girl who appreciated the small, predictable comforts of her life, like the warm soup her mother always had waiting on the stove. Her father was a quiet man who spent his days in the heat of the steel mills, and her mother was a meticulous seamstress. Claire spent her evenings helping her mother repair the heavy work clothes of the local miners, a routine that involved measuring seams and matching threads by the light of a small desk lamp. She dreamed of moving to Brussels to study art, a near-future expectation that kept her focused during the long Belgian winters. She had a habit of counting the steps from the bus stop to her front door, a rhythmic way of measuring her progress through the long Belgian evenings. She was currently at 412, focusing on the sound of her own boots on the cobblestones. The walk usually took exactly 12 minutes, a fact she had verified many times with the small silver watch her parents had given her for her birthday. The two girls were laughing about a scene in the film, their breath blooming in white clouds that vanished almost instantly into the yellow haze. Claire adjusted the strap of her school bag, feeling the weight of her biology textbooks against her hip. She was a meticulous student who always kept her notes organized in a series of color-coded folders. She felt a deep sense of security in the familiarity of her town, believing that the grit of the Iron City was a shield rather than a threat. They reached the corner of an intersection where the factories loomed like giant teeth, silent monsters in the fog. The street was unusually quiet, with most of the workers already home and the shops shuttered for the night. Claire looked toward the next streetlight, which was barely visible through the shifting mist. She noticed the faint, orange glow of a car's headlights approaching slowly from the direction of the docks. The car was a sleek, expensive model that looked out of place among the rusted bicycles and small hatchbacks of the neighborhood. It slowed to a crawl and then stopped beside them, the engine idling with a low, smooth purr. A man in his late 50s rolled down the window, revealing a face that looked kind and professional, like a doctor or a local magistrate. He wore a high-quality wool coat and a silk scarf tucked neatly into his collar. He leaned toward the passenger side and asked if the girls needed a lift. Noting that the fog was becoming too dangerous for young women to be out alone, he spoke with a soft, educated accent that suggested he was a man of importance in the community. Claire hesitated, but the damp cold was beginning to seep through her boots, and Sophie was shivering so hard her teeth were chattering. The man smiled warmly and told them he lived just 2 streets away from Claire's house. Claire reached for the door handle, her fingers cold and stiff against the polished metal. As she pulled the door open, the interior of the car greeted her with the smell of rich leather and the faint, sweet scent of expensive pipe tobacco. She sat in the back seat and heard the door close with a heavy, pressurized thud that seemed to block out the entire world. The air inside was warm and still, but as the car began to move, she felt a sharp spike of adrenaline, because the man did not turn toward her street. He turned directly toward the darkened warehouses of the industrial district. Why did I think a silk scarf meant he was safe? The streetlights quickly began to thin out as the car moved deeper into the labyrinth of the Iron City. Claire watched the back of the man's head, noticing that he was not looking in the rearview mirror or checking his gauges. He was staring straight ahead into the fog with a focused, clinical intensity. She felt the heavy school bag on her lap, a useless weight that offered no protection against the silence filling the cabin. The car stopped in front of a low, brick building that looked like a warehouse for mining equipment. The man turned off the engine and the headlights, leaving the girls in a state of total darkness. He did not speak as he stepped out and walked to the rear of the car, his footsteps clicking on the cobblestones with a rhythmic, metallic sound. Claire tried to open her door, but the lock remained fixed, a small piece of chrome that refused to move. He opened the passenger door and gestured for the girls to step out, his kind expression replaced by a cold, flat gaze. He held a small, heavy object in his hand that glinted in the dim light of the fog. Claire and Sophie were led down a flight of concrete stairs that smelled of coal dust and stagnant water. They were pushed into a large basement room where a heavy workbench sat against the far wall, covered in an assortment of specialized tools. Behind the workbench, the man revealed a small, concealed door that was perfectly flush with the brickwork. He slid the bench aside with a surprising amount of strength and pushed the girls into a windowless cell. The room was barely larger than a walk-in closet, containing only a stained mattress and a chemical toilet in the corner. The walls were lined with heavy, acoustic foam that looked as though it had been installed by a professional. The man stepped back and pulled the door shut, and Claire heard the unmistakable sound of a heavy iron bolt sliding into place. A moment later, she heard the muffled grinding sound of the workbench being pushed back into its original position. The silence that followed was absolute, a thick and suffocating weight that the acoustic foam seemed to draw directly from the air. She realized then that they could scream for days, and the workers in the building above would never hear a single sound. The point of no return had been a turn toward the docks, and now they were trapped in a space that had been designed for this exact purpose. Claire still tried to use the logic of her ordinary life, telling Sophie that her father would be looking for them and that the man would eventually let them go. She tried to imagine that this was just a bizarre misunderstanding that would be resolved with an apology. But as the hours turned into a full day, the old logic began to break down under the pressure of the darkness. She realized that the man was not a doctor or a magistrate. He was a person who viewed them as objects to be stored. The escalation happened when the man returned and began to ask them questions about their families and their daily routines. He did not use violence at first, but his voice was a cold, monotone drone that stripped away their sense of identity. Claire made an active choice to stop crying and to start counting the seconds between the sounds she could hear from the floor above. She realized that if she could understand the rhythm of the building, she might find a way to anticipate his next move. She heard the distant hum of a freight elevator and the sound of heavy crates being moved across the floor. These were the sounds of a functioning business, a place where people worked and laughed while she sat in a soundproofed hole. The contrast between the ordinary world above and the horror below was more terrifying than the darkness itself. After 48 hours of captivity, the girls were suddenly blindfolded and led out of the basement into the foggy streets of the industrial district. The man told them that if they ever spoke of the room or his face, he would find their families and ensure that no one ever saw them again. They were left wandering near a coal yard, their clothes covered in gray dust and their eyes red from the lack of sleep. They were found by a night watchman who initially thought they were runaways. The investigation was a series of cold, reconstructive failures that would haunt the city of Charleroi for decades. Claire and Sophie provided a detailed description of the building and the man, but the police were remarkably hesitant to follow the lead. The warehouse was owned by a local businessman who had deep ties to the city council and the regional police department. He was a man of influence who provided jobs for hundreds of families, and the authorities were reluctant to believe he was a predator. When a young detective finally secured a search warrant and entered the basement, he found the workbench exactly where Claire had described it. He slid the heavy table aside and found the concealed door, but the room inside had been stripped of the acoustic foam and the mattress. The walls had been freshly painted, and the chemical toilet had been replaced with a stack of old mining maps. The businessman claimed the room was a historic bomb shelter from the war era. He argued that he used the small space for storing archives and that the girls must have been confused by the fog. Because of his local influence and the lack of physical evidence, the investigation was stalled by higher orders. The girls' testimony was dismissed as hysterical and the result of the trauma of being lost in the industrial district. No charges were ever filed against the businessman, and he continued to operate his company for another 20 years. The room under the earth remained a secret, a hidden cell in a building that thousands of people passed every single day. The twist in the case arrived years later, long after the girls had reached adulthood. Investigators looking into the infamous Belgian monster cases of the 90s discovered that many of the tactics used by serial predators in the region had been perfected decades earlier. The soundproofed room was not an isolated incident. It was part of a larger, systemic pattern. The businessman had been a first warning that the country had chosen to ignore in favor of maintaining the status quo. The climax of the story for Claire was not the discovery of the room, but the realization that the justice system had been designed to protect the powerful. She had to live with the knowledge that her captor was still walking the same streets as her father. The weight of the secret was a heavy fog that never lifted from her life. The final verdict on the Charleroi basement is a cold summary of missed opportunities and institutional failure. The businessman died in the late 90s, taking the full extent of his crimes to the grave. The building was eventually renovated, and the basement was filled with concrete to reinforce the foundation. The physical evidence of the girls' captivity was destroyed, leaving only their words as a precarious record of what happened under the earth. The aftershock of the case claimed a final victim years later, Sophie, who had never been able to cope with the fact that her captor was never punished, committed suicide on the 10th anniversary of their disappearance. She had spent a decade feeling as though she were still trapped in that soundproofed cell, unable to hear the world outside. Claire was left as the sole witness to a darkness that the city had tried to bury. The final drop in the file is a detail from the original police report that was only revealed recently. When the detective first entered the concealed room, he found a single, small item that had been missed during the businessman's cleaning. Tucked into a crack in the floorboards was a small, color-coded folder containing a set of biology notes. It belonged to a 16-year-old girl who had once dreamed of studying art in Brussels. The industrial fog of Charleroi eventually clears, revealing the rusted skeletons of the steel mills and the silent docks of the Sambre River. But some things remain hidden beneath the surface, waiting for the ground to crack. That same sense of a life being interrupted by a trusted authority was echoing in the mountains of Mexico. A famous musician was about to reach a military bus stop where his final song would be cut short. The bridge from the iron city of Belgium to the mountains of Guerrero is built from the same kind of cold, calculated betrayal. Both cases involve a person taken by an authority figure and hidden in a space that officially did not exist. Another kind of darkness is waiting ahead in the dust of the Mexican highway, where the song of the white eagle would finally fall silent. August 25th, 1974. The bus was bouncing along the unpaved highway near Atoyac de Alvarez in the state of Guerrero, Mexico. Tita sat in the worn vinyl seat, watching the green mountains roll past the window in a blur of heat and dust. He was 13 years old and was traveling with his father, Rosendo Radilla Pacheco, a man who seemed to carry the rhythm of the entire region in his hands. Rosendo was 46 years old and was a well-known figure in the coastal villages. He was a composer of corridos, the traditional narrative songs that told the stories of the people, their struggles, and their history. Tita watched his father hum a low melody under his breath, his fingers tapping a rhythmic pattern on his knee, as if he were already composing the next verse. They were on their way to visit family, a routine trip that usually involved long hours of talk and the smell of roasting corn. The elder Radilla was a man of quiet dignity who had served as a local leader and an activist for the rural farmers. He was respected for his honesty and his ability to put the complicated feelings of the community into simple, powerful lyrics. Tita felt a deep sense of pride whenever they walked through a market and people would stop to shake his father's hand. He believed his father was untouchable because he was a man of the people, someone whose voice was part of the landscape. Their lives were defined by the predictable cycles of the planting season and the local festivals where Rosendo would perform. Tita spent his days in school and his afternoons helping his father with the small business they ran in town. He expected his future to follow the same steady path, perhaps learning to play the guitar himself one day. He felt a sense of security in the familiar weight of his father's presence in the seat next to him. Inside the bus, the afternoon heat was a thick blanket that seemed to press against Tita's chest. He felt the sweat trickling down his spine and the constant, rhythmic vibration of the old diesel engine in his teeth. A shadow suddenly fell over him as a soldier with a stone face leaned into the aisle, the smell of gun oil and stale cigarettes blocking out the mountain air. Tita thought to himself that if he just held his breath, the soldier would see only a boy and pass by. The first strange detail appeared when the bus groaned to a halt at a military roadblock that had not been there the week before. 3 soldiers in dark olive uniforms boarded the vehicle, their boots thudding heavily on the metal floor. They didn't look at the bags or the cargo in the overhead racks. They walked straight toward the middle of the bus, their eyes scanning the faces of the passengers with a predatory focus that made the air feel thin. One of the soldiers stopped at their row and looked directly at Rosendo. He didn't ask for a passport or a travel permit. He simply stated his father's full name and told him to step out of the bus for a moment. Tita felt his father's hand tighten on his own for a split second before Rosendo stood up, his face remarkably calm. He told Tita to stay in his seat and wait for him to return, his voice steady and devoid of fear. The point of no return happened when the soldiers led Rosendo toward a small group of military trucks parked on the shoulder of the road. Tita watched through the back window as the sergeant in charge gestured for the bus driver to continue his route. He tried to stand up, but a soldier standing by the door gave him a firm shove back into his seat. The bus engine roared to life, and the vehicle began to pull away, leaving his father standing in a cloud of gray exhaust. Tita watched until his father was just a small, dark speck against the vast green of the Guerrero Mountains. He realized then that the soldiers were not checking papers, and they were not looking for a bribe. They had been waiting specifically for the man who sang the songs of the people. The bus continued toward Atoyac. But for Tita, the world had suddenly become a vacuum where his father used to be. He arrived at his destination alone and immediately told his family what had happened at the roadblock. They spent the next 48 hours traveling back to the site. But the military trucks were gone, and the road was empty. They went to the local police station and then to the military barracks in Atoyac, but every officer they spoke to denied that a roadblock had ever existed. They were told that Rosendo must have simply decided to leave his family or had been taken by one of the many bandit groups in the area. The escalation of the mystery was a decades-long process of searching and being ignored. Tita and his mother visited every hospital, morgue, and prison in the state, carrying a small black and white photograph of Rosendo. They were met with a wall of silence that felt like a physical barrier. The state officially maintained that Rosendo Radilla did not exist in their records, and that no such arrest had ever taken place during the summer of 1974. The voice of the investigation turned cold and reconstructive as the years passed into the 1980s and 90s. The Radilla family became leaders in a movement of families who had lost loved ones to the military during the period known as the Dirty War. They learned that hundreds of people had been taken at similar checkpoints, vanishing into a system of secret prisons that the government refused to acknowledge. They were looking for a man, but they were fighting against a ghost. The investigation took a dramatic turn in the early 2000s when declassified documents from the Mexican intelligence agencies began to surface. These records confirmed that Rosendo Radilla had indeed been taken into custody by the military on that August afternoon. He had been classified as a person of interest because his songs were considered a form of political agitation. The documents placed him at the Cuartel de Atoyac, a military base that survivors later described as a factory of screams. The twist in the case was the revelation that the military had kept meticulous logs of the people they took, even while they were lying to the families at the front gate. After 30 years of denial, the evidence showed that Rosendo had been held in a clandestine section of the base that was technically invisible to the public. The state had not just taken a man, they had constructed an entire alternate reality to hide his disappearance. The climax of the story arrived when the Inter-American Court of Human Rights took up the case. They found the Mexican state responsible for the forced disappearance of Rosendo Radilla, marking the first time the country was internationally condemned for its actions during that era. The court ordered a full search for his remains and a public apology to the family. However, even with the weight of an international ruling, the physical truth remained buried. The final verdict is that Rosendo Radilla was likely executed shortly after his arrival at the military base, though no official record of his death has ever been produced. His body was never returned to his family, and the specific location of his burial remains a state secret. The soldiers who took him from the bus were never identified or charged with a crime. The songs he wrote are still sung in the mountains, but the man who wrote them was effectively erased from history. The aftershock of the disappearance changed the legal landscape of Mexico, leading to new laws that made forced disappearance a specific and severe crime. Tita spent the rest of his life as an activist, ensuring that his father's name was never forgotten. He lived with the memory of that cloud of dust on the highway, a moment that divided his life into before and after. The silence of the state was eventually broken, but it could not bring back the man who hummed melodies in the seat of a bus. The final drop in the file is a single sheet of paper found in a restricted archive decades later. It was a fragment of a song lyric written in a hand that Tita recognized instantly as his father's. It was dated several weeks after the disappearance, suggesting that Rosendo was still composing even while he was being held in the darkness of the cell. The song was never finished, ending abruptly in the middle of a verse about the white eagles that circled the peaks of Guerrero. The dusty roads of Mexico eventually lead back to the high-altitude fog of the city. Across the ocean in Hong Kong, a hiker was about to climb Braemar Hill and find a young woman who had been turned into a cinematic horror. The beauty of the overlook was about to be stained by a ritual that no one could explain. The next story is one where the violence was personal, but the motive remained as distant as the harbor below. The bridge from the mountains of Mexico to the hills of Hong Kong is built from the same kind of silent, tragic interruption. Both cases involve a person whose life was cut short in a remote location, leaving behind only fragments of who they were. Another kind of darkness is waiting ahead in the mist of Braemar Hill, where a single flower would tell a story of a killer's obsession. "5:30 in the morning, October 1975. Wing was leaning on his bamboo walking stick as he climbed the final stretch of the dirt path leading toward the summit of Braemar Hill. The Hong Kong heat had not yet arrived, leaving the air on the ridge cool and heavy with a damp mountain mist. Wing was a man of 62 who had lived in the crowded tenements of North Point for most of his life, and these early morning hikes were his only escape from the noise of the city. He was a man who valued the predictable geometry of the landscape. Every morning, Wing followed the same line of trees and crossed the same rocky stream, timing his movements so that he reached the overlook exactly as the first light of dawn touched the water of Victoria Harbor. He carried a small thermos of green tea and a jade pendant in his pocket that he rubbed for good luck. To Wing, the mountain was a sanctuary of order in a city that was growing far too fast for its own good. The mid-70s in Hong Kong was a time of rapid, chaotic change. New skyscrapers were rising like glass teeth along the shoreline, and the streets below were a constant roar of construction and commerce. Wing preferred the hills because they felt permanent. He spent his days working in a small grocery stall, meticulously stacking tins of condensed milk and bags of rice. His life was defined by the rhythm of the market and the quiet, high-altitude peace of his morning walks. He had a routine of stopping at a specific flat granite rock to perform a series of slow, deliberate stretches before the descent. It was a near-future expectation that usually brought him a sense of calm. He looked forward to the moment when the fog would roll back, revealing the cargo ships in the distance. He felt a deep sense of security in his anonymity, believing that in a city of millions, a man who follows the rules is invisible to the darkness that lives in the alleyways. As he reached the summit, the mist was so thick that the trees looked like gray ghosts. Wing noticed a dark shape lying on the flat granite overlook where he usually stood. At first, he thought it was a fellow hiker who had arrived early and fallen asleep, or perhaps a young couple who had spent the night watching the stars. He slowed his pace, his boots crunching softly on the loose gravel. He didn't want to disturb anyone, but the way the person was lying felt entirely wrong for the slope of the rock. He walked closer, his breath blooming in white clouds. He reached the edge of the granite overlook. The air was a cold, damp blanket that smelled of mountain pine and the heavy, metallic exhaust of the ferries in Victoria Harbor below. He felt the rough, budding texture of the stone through the soles of his shoes. And as he looked at the dark shape on the ledge, a single thought flashed through his mind. I am standing inside a man's dream, and I need to wake up before he sees me. The figure on the rock was a young woman, likely in her early 20s. She was lying on her back, her legs straight and her arms at her sides, positioned perfectly to face the rising sun over the harbor. She appeared to be sunbathing, but the sun had not yet broken the horizon. Wing saw that her eyes were wide open and fixed on the gray sky. He stood frozen for several seconds, the only sound being the distant, rhythmic clang of a buoy in the water far below. He noticed that the girl's clothing was neat and appeared to have been carefully adjusted. She was wearing a simple cotton dress that looked as though it had been freshly laundered. As he stepped nearer, his logic began to fail him. There was no blood on the rock and no sign that a struggle had taken place in the dirt surrounding the overlook. He realized with a sudden, cold clarity that she had not died on this hill, but had been brought here and placed like a piece of furniture. Wing turned and ran down the trail, his bamboo stick clattering against the stones. He reached a police box near the base of the hill and told the officer that there was a sleeping girl on the summit who would not wake up. Within an hour, the quiet beauty of Braemar Hill was invaded by the blue lights of the Hong Kong police. They cordoned off the path and set up a canvas tent over the granite rock to preserve the scene from the morning drizzle. The investigation took on a colder, more reconstructive tone as the detectives began to process the body. They discovered that the woman had been strangled with a great deal of force. But that was not the most disturbing detail. The forensic pathologist noted that the victim's body had been thoroughly cleaned after her death. Every trace of dirt or struggle had been washed away, and her hair had been brushed until it shone. She had been prepared for a viewing. The police checked every missing persons report in the colony, but no one matched the description of the girl on the hill. They visited the factories in Kowloon and the shipping offices in Central, showing photographs of her face to thousands of workers. They believed that in a city with such high density, someone must have known her name, but the girl remained a shadow. She was a nobody in a city of millions, a person who had vanished into the mountain fog without a single hand reaching out to stop her. The mystery widened when the police examined the objects found with the body. They discovered a single, small wild flower clutched in her right hand. It was a local variety of jasmine that grew in the lower valleys, but it did not grow anywhere near the summit of Braemar Hill. The flower was fresh, its petals vibrant and unscented. It had been placed there with a level of care that suggested a romantic delusion or a ritualistic obsession on the part of the killer. The twist in the case arrived when a botanist pointed out that the flower had been plucked within 2 hours of the body being discovered. This meant the killer had not just staged the scene and fled. He had likely stayed on the hill, watching the harbor and waiting for the morning light to hit his creation. He might have even been standing in the shadows of the trees when Wing first reached the summit. The crime was not just a murder, it was a cinematic performance for an audience of one. Despite the intensity of the search, the police never found a single witness who saw the girl being carried up the hill. No one reported a suspicious vehicle or a man walking into the woods with a heavy burden. The girl in the dress remained unidentified for years, her file becoming one of Hong Kong's most haunting cold cases. The lack of a motive and the strange, respectful staging of the remains defied every criminal profile the authorities possessed. The verdict on the Braemar Hill mystery is a cold summary of a life that was turned into an image. The person who killed her used the landscape as a gallery and the victim as his canvas. The file remains open in the historical archives of the Hong Kong Police Museum, but the passage of 50 years has erased any hope of a forensic breakthrough. The girl was buried in a nameless grave, her identity lost in the rapid urbanization of the 1970s. The aftershock of the discovery changed the way hikers viewed the high overlooks of the city. People stopped climbing Braemar Hill alone at dawn, and the sight of a single flower on a rock became a source of genuine dread. Wing never returned to his summit routine, finding that the sanctuary of the mountain had been permanently stained by the memory of those wide, staring eyes. He spent the rest of his life walking the crowded city streets, where at least the darkness was easy to see. The final drop in the story is the detail of the jasmine flower itself. When the police finally removed it from the girl's hand, they found a small, handwritten note tucked inside the petals. It contained no name and no message, only a series of numbers that appeared to be a set of map coordinates. When the detectives went to that location, they found nothing but an empty, windowless room in an abandoned building overlooking the sea. The killer was gone, leaving behind only the cold air and the sound of the waves. The cinematic mist of Hong Kong eventually clears, revealing the lights of a city that never stops moving. But some secrets are buried in the high-altitude fog, waiting for a hiker who never comes. This same kind of silent, domestic horror was being felt in the elite suburbs of Athens. In a wealthy villa in Kifisia, a group of workers was about to break through a wall and find a secret that a family had tried to bury in the concrete. The bridge from the hills of Hong Kong to the villas of Greece is built from the same kind of cold, hidden tragedy. Both cases involve a person whose life was absorbed into a building or a landscape, kept secret by the people who should have protected them. Another kind of darkness is waiting ahead in the basement of the Kifisia house, where the scratch marks on a door would tell a story of a long and silent captivity. In July of 1975, the heat in the elite Athens suburb of Kifisia was a heavy, stagnant weight that seemed to vibrate off the white marble of the villas. Nikos was kneeling on a damp concrete floor in a basement, his hands covered in a thick layer of gray sludge and old plaster. He was 38 years old and had worked as a master plumber for 2 decades. A man who understood the hidden veins and arteries of the city's most expensive homes. He was a professional who lived by the logic of the blueprint and the reliability of the wrench. Nikos spent his days navigating the dark, cool spaces beneath the surface of the world, finding a quiet satisfaction in fixing what was broken and making the water flow where it was supposed to. He carried a heavy leather tool bag that smelled of machine oil and copper, and he kept his receipts organized in a small metal box in the back of his van. The political atmosphere in Greece was in a state of fragile transition following the fall of the military junta the year before. The streets of Athens were filled with a mixture of hope and a lingering, quiet paranoia that the old powers had not truly left. Nikos preferred to stay out of the cafes where men argued about the new government, choosing instead to focus on the tangible reality of his work. He had a wife and 3 sons to support, and a contract in Kifisia was the kind of high-paying job that could secure their future for an entire year. His life was a series of rhythmic, predictable responsibilities and modest goals. He planned to finish the renovation of the villa by the end of August, so he could take his family to the coast for a week of fishing and quiet sun. He took a deep pride in his reputation for discretion, a quality that was highly valued by the wealthy families who lived behind the tall iron gates of the northern suburbs. He believed that if he did his job well and kept his head down, the chaos of the changing country would never touch his doorstep. He had a habit of checking the water pressure 3 times before leaving a job site, a mechanical routine that ensured he never had to return for a mistake. He always wore a clean blue jumpsuit and carried a small, silver flashlight clipped to his belt. He was currently working in a villa owned by a prominent family with deep connections to the shipping industry and the previous military regime. The house was a sprawling neoclassical mansion that felt unusually cold despite the blistering heat of the Greek summer. Nikos was tasked with rerouting the main drainage pipes to accommodate a new laundry room being built in the lower level. He found a section of the basement wall that didn't match the plumbing diagrams provided by the architect. The blueprints showed a solid foundation of reinforced concrete, but when Nikos tapped on the surface, the sound that returned was thin and resonant. He called the homeowner over, a man who always wore a dark suit and stood in the shadows of the stairs, watching the work with a silent, judging intensity. The man told Nikos that the wall was simply a structural pillar added during the war and that he should ignore the discrepancy and work around it. But the angle of the new pipes required a direct path through the masonry, and the man's nervous, shifting eyes suggested that the pillar held more than just weight. Nikos felt a slight chill in the humid basement, a small crack in the professional order of the day that he could not immediately ignore. He waited until the homeowner left the room to take a closer look at the seams of the brickwork. The first strange detail appeared when he shone his flashlight along the base of the wall. He saw that the mortar was a different color than the rest of the basement, appearing much newer and less weathered. There was a faint, sour smell of lime and stagnant air leaking through a small gap near the floorboards. Nikos took his heavy sledgehammer from his bag, his heart beginning to beat with a slow, heavy thrum in his chest. He knew he should follow the instructions, but the logic of the pipes demanded that he see what was behind the barrier. The basement was a tomb of stagnant heat and the sharp, chalky scent of pulverized lime. Nikos felt the heavy sledgehammer vibrate through his forearms as the homeowner's footsteps creaked rhythmically on the floorboards directly above his head. He looked at the white plaster dust coating his boots and thought to himself that some walls are built not to hold up a house, but to hold down a memory. The hammer hit the brick with a dull, hollow thud that echoed through the empty basement. On the third swing, a large section of the masonry collapsed inward, revealing a dark, windowless cavity that was not on any map. Nikos stepped through the opening, the beam of his flashlight cutting through a thick cloud of dust that had been settling for years. The air inside was freezing and carried a heavy, metallic scent that made the back of his throat itch. The hidden room was barely larger than a prison cell, with walls made of rough, unpainted stone. In the corner sat a rusted iron cot with a thin, stained mattress that looked as though it had been chewed by rats. There was a small wooden table with a single ceramic bowl and a stack of yellowed newspapers dating back to 1968. The space was a capsule of long-term habitation, a secret life that had been lived in total silence beneath the feet of the unsuspecting neighborhood. He walked to the back of the door that led into the main basement and saw that it had been reinforced with a heavy steel plate. The most horrifying detail was the condition of the wood around the iron latch. The surface was covered in thousands of deep, jagged scratch marks that had been cut into the grain by human fingernails. It was a visual record of a desperate, years-long struggle to reach the other side of a door that never opened. Nikos backed out of the room, his movements stiff and mechanical, and he immediately packed his tools into his bag. He didn't say a word to the homeowner, who was standing at the top of the stairs with a cold, unreadable expression on his face. Nikos drove straight to a small newspaper office in the city center and told his story to a young journalist named Kostas. He knew that if he went to the local police, the report would likely vanish before the ink was even dry. The investigation into the villa in Kifisia was a brief and violent collision between the new democracy and the old guard. Kostas spent a week digging into the history of the property, discovering that a foreign domestic worker had disappeared from the household in the late 60s. The family had claimed she had simply returned to her home country, and because of their connections to the military junta, no one had dared to question the story. The hidden room was a private detention center used to bury a person who had seen too much. The voice of the reconstruction turned colder as the journalist discovered that the basement had undergone several renovations during the height of the political purges. Each new layer of concrete and brick had been used to absorb the evidence of the people who were kept there. The house was not just a home, it was a living archive of the crimes of the elite. Mystery widened as the journalist realized that the Kifisia villa was only one of dozens of similar properties across the northern suburbs. The investigation hit a dead end when a skull was found buried beneath a row of rose bushes in the villa's garden during a follow-up search. The remains were taken to a local precinct for identification, but the forensic report was mysteriously lost during a small fire in the evidence locker later that month. The family used their remaining influence to secure a court order that halted all further excavations on the property, citing the need to protect the architectural heritage of the neighborhood. The twist in the story was the realization that the justice system was still being governed by the same higher orders that had authorized the secret rooms in the first place. The transition to democracy was a surface-level change that had not yet reached the foundations of the power structure. The woman in the basement was not a missing person. She was a casualty of a system that viewed certain lives as disposable. The truth was known, but it was functionally irrelevant in a world that prioritized the stability of the elite. The climax of the mystery occurred when the villa was abruptly sold to a foreign shipping magnate and the entire basement was filled with a thick layer of reinforced concrete. The hidden room, the scratch marks, and the memory of the rusted cot were physically erased from the world. Nikos watched from a distance as the cement trucks lined up at the iron gates, their drums rotating with a rhythmic, mechanical sound that seemed to drown out the screams of the past. The final verdict on the Kifisia gravehouse is a cold summary of institutionalized silence. No one was ever charged with a crime, and the identity of the woman who scratched at the door remains a mystery. The family moved to a private estate in Switzerland, taking their secrets with them and leaving behind a house that had been successfully sanitized. The records of the investigation were eventually shredded, leaving only the testimony of a plumber who saw something he wasn't supposed to see. The aftershock of the case remained with Nikos for the rest of his life, changing the way he viewed every job he took in the wealthy parts of the city. He could no longer walk into a basement without tapping on the walls. Searching for the hollow sound of a hidden history, he stopped trusting the blueprints and the diagrams, realizing that the most important parts of a building are often the ones that are never drawn. He spent his final years working in the older, poorer parts of Athens, where the secrets were easier to handle. The villa in Kifisia still stands, a beautiful neoclassical monument to an era of Greek history that many would prefer to forget. The garden is lush and well-maintained, and the new owners are known for their elegant dinner parties and their commitment to local charities. The guests walk across the marble floors of the terrace, unaware that just a few feet beneath their expensive shoes, a layer of concrete holds a secret that was never allowed to breathe. The 12 stories we have walked through tonight are more than just a list of tragedies or a series of unsolved files. They represent a specific kind of darkness that exists just beneath the surface of the ordinary world. Whether it was a plumber in Greece or a hiker in Finland, these people all stumbled upon a truth that was never meant to be seen. It is the realization that our reality is often a fragile construction held together by our own collective denial. When we look back at the Vistula River in Poland or the cliffs of Stevens Klint in Denmark, a pattern begins to emerge. It is the pattern of clinical erasure. In both cases, the victims were not just killed, they were processed. Their labels were unpicked, their skin was removed, and their identities were surgically separated from their physical remains. This is the hallmark of a predator who does not just want to destroy a life, but to ensure that the life never truly existed. There is a terrifying logic in the way these secrets were kept. In the Singapore wet market and on the hills of Hong Kong, the victims were returned to public spaces in a state of impossible cleanliness. The well was searched 3 times, and the granite rock was a popular overlook. Yet the bodies appeared only when the killer decided the scene was ready. It suggests that the most dangerous person is the one who can move through a crowd without ever being noticed by it. In the mountains of Nepal and the deserts of Argentina, we see the power of the vacuum. A man waves from a doorway and then vanishes from a snowy plateau without leaving a single track. A couple is taken from a bus and then erased from the official records of the state. These cases remind us that geography and authority can be used as weapons of silence. Sometimes, a person doesn't get lost in the landscape. The landscape is simply folded over them until they disappear. The maritime knot in New Zealand and the leather trunk in the Netherlands tell a story of a different kind of staging. These were victims who were found in specific ways that implied a heavy, distorted emotional connection, whether it was the care taken to dress a girl in a gorse bush or the placement of a trunk under a pine tree. These killers left behind a signature of their own obsession. They wanted the world to see their work, but they didn't want the world to see them. We must also consider the stories of the hidden rooms in Belgium and Greece. These were crimes built into the very foundations of the homes and warehouses where people lived and worked. The soundproofed acoustic foam and the scratch marks on the back of a door are physical evidence of a terror that was allowed to exist because people chose to look the other way. It is a reminder that the loudest screams are often the ones that are buried under a layer of social influence. The interrupted song of the White Eagle in Mexico serves as a bridge to the darkest theme of all the betrayal by those meant to protect us. When a musician is taken at a routine bus stop by the army, it shatters the logic of the ordinary world. It proves that the right paperwork and a valid passport are useless against a system that has decided you are no longer a person. In these stories, the predator is not a monster in the woods, but a man in a uniform. As a narrator, I often find that the most haunting detail isn't the violence itself, but the small, mundane objects that survive the victim. A silver thimble in a hidden room, a single jasmine flower on a hill, or a set of biology notes in a coal-dusted basement. These items are the only remains of a life that was meant to be forgotten. They are the wrong notes that the killer couldn't quite silence, the tiny fragments of the truth that eventually rose back to the surface. The lesson we must take from these 12 cases is one of profound vigilance. We live in a world that prizes order and predictability, but these stories prove that order is often just a thin veil. The predator counts on our desire to explain away the first strange detail. They count on us believing that the car door closing in the fog is just a neighbor coming home, or that the empty orange tent is just an abandoned piece of gear. We must learn to trust the chill. If there is a common thread that connects the snowy peaks of the Himalayas to the industrial streets of Charleroi, it is the silence of the witness. In almost every story tonight, someone saw something that didn't fit, but they didn't speak until it was too late. The hiker in Finland, the plumber in Greece, the son on the bus in Mexico, they all lived inside the misunderstanding first. They only saw the truth once the ground had already cracked beneath their feet. The weight of the unknown is perhaps the heaviest burden of all. The man in the orange tent and the girl in the leather trunk are still nameless decades later. Despite the best efforts of modern forensics, they represent the lost souls of the 20th century. People who were taken from the timeline before they could leave a permanent mark. Their graves are empty spaces in the history of the world. Reminders that a person can be meticulously erased if no one knows where to look. We often ask why we are drawn to these dark histories, why we spend our late nights listening to the details of disappearances and betrayals. It is not because we enjoy the horror, but because we are searching for the exit. We are looking for the point where the logic broke so we can ensure it doesn't break for us. We listen to find the wrong note before the song ends, hoping that by understanding the anatomy of the secret, we can keep ourselves from becoming part of one. The world is still full of these silent spaces, from the high desert passes to the basements of elite villas. The concrete in Kifisia may have buried the room, but it could not bury the scratch marks on the soul of the witness. The mountains of Nepal still hold the space where a traveler used to be, and the Vistula River still carries the memory of a pale shroud. These stories don't end when the file is closed, they stay in the air, a cold aftertaste that never quite vanishes. If you have stayed with me through all 12 of these journeys, I appreciate your willingness to look into the shadows. If the tone of these stories resonates with you, and if you value the calm, cold logic of the truth, I invite you to join this community by subscribing. We will continue to explore the places where the light doesn't reach, and the stories that the world tried to bury. Only by speaking the names of the missing can we prevent them from being erased a second time. Now, take a look around the room where you are sitting. Notice the surfaces, the shadows, and the sound of the silence. We like to believe that our homes are sanctuaries, but every building has a history, and every foundation holds a secret. The danger doesn't always come with a scream. Sometimes, it arrives as a polite stranger with a silk scarf, or a military truck on a dusty road. The people closest to the tragedy are usually the ones who see the signs last. Think about the human anchors we discussed tonight, the stones from England, the trunks from department stores, the concrete of the suburbs. They were all designed to keep the truth from floating to the surface. But the truth is a buoyant thing. It finds its way through the cracks in the masonry and the shifts in the riverbed. A thimble or a tuft of wool is all it takes to sink a lie that has been told for 50 years. The logic of the void eventually fails. The final drop in this episode is not a verdict or a legal status. It is a feeling. It is that sudden, sharp realization you get when you notice something is slightly off in a place you thought you knew by heart. It is the sound of a gate swinging on its hinges, or a wave from a doorway that leads to nowhere. These are the moments when the fourth wall of our reality erases itself, and we find ourselves trapped inside a story that we can no longer control. The families of Rosendo Radila, Kirsty Bentley, and the girl in the well are still waiting for a final answer that may never arrive. They are the ones who have to live in the silence that the predator left behind. Their lives are defined by the absence of a person, a hollow weight that no amount of time can lighten. They remind us that the real weight of a case isn't found in the autopsy report, but in the empty chair at the dinner table on New Year's Eve. As the night continues and the mist rolls in from the mountains or the sea, remember the people we talked about tonight. Remember the architect who sketched the desert, the girl who walked her dog, and the musician who hummed a melody on a bus. They were all just living their ordinary lives until the moment the world decided to fold. Their stories are a warning that the ordinary is a gift, and the silence of a quiet street is something we should never take for granted. Nature doesn't hide people. Only people have the capacity for such clinical, calculated erasure. A mountain spirits away a trekker in folklore, but in reality, it is a human hand that removes the rucksack. A ghost doesn't clean a body and place it in a well, a neighbor does. The most terrifying thing about these 12 stories is not that they are mysterious, but that they are human. They are the result of choices made in the dark by people who look just like us. We will leave the Vistula, the Andes, and the hills of Hong Kong behind for now. But the aftershock of these cases will remain. The shadows in your own peripheral vision might feel a bit heavier tonight, and the sound of a car idling in the fog might make you pause. That is the intended effect. To stay safe, you must first acknowledge that the danger exists, and that it is often much closer than you think. The darkness is not a destination, it is a neighbor. Take a deep breath and listen to the rhythm of your own heart. It is a steady, predictable beat that anchors you to the present moment. But remember the man in the orange tent who looked as though he was just taking a nap. His heart had stopped weeks before, yet his campsite was pristine. The appearance of order is the predator's greatest weapon. Do not be fooled by the high-quality wool coat or the polite request for directions. Notice the wrong note. The final image I want to leave you with is the single jasmine flower in the hand of the girl on Braemar Hill. It was a beautiful, romantic gesture that hid a brutal, personal murder. It is the perfect metaphor for the stories we have shared. On the surface, there is beauty, staging, and ritual, but beneath the petals, there is only the cold, unyielding granite of the truth. Some things are removed with such care that you realize the person was never the point. The night is cold, and the path ahead is still unmapped, but we will walk it together, looking for the clues that the world tried to burn. We will find the thimbles in the concrete and the knots in the leather. We will hum the interrupted songs until the final verse is written. Until next time, keep your eyes on the shadows and your hand on the latch, because the stories that are never supposed to be told are usually the ones that matter the most. Thank you for listening to this episode of Real Life Mysteries and Dark History. I hope the silence of your own space is a peaceful one tonight, and that the only surprises you find are the ones you have planned for. Sleep well, if the logic of the world allows it, but if you hear a scratching on the other side of the door, or if the fog seems to follow you a little too closely, remember that the truth is always there, waiting to be pulled from the water.